Number 1, Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, a community compliance officer and church council president who terrorized Wichita, Kansas, for over 3 decades while hiding in plain sight. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, one of 4 sons born to Dorothea May Cook and William Elvin Rader. The family lived a relatively ordinary mid-century American life, eventually settling in Wichita when Dennis was a young boy. Those who knew him during his early years described him as quiet, polite, and largely unremarkable, a boy who blended into the background of his classrooms and neighborhoods. He attended Riverview Elementary School and later Wichita Heights High School, where he was an average student who participated in few extracurricular activities. Beneath this unassuming exterior, however, dark compulsions were already taking root. Rader later admitted that from a very young age, he experienced sadistic sexual fantasies involving bondage, torture, and death, fantasies that he carefully concealed from everyone around him. After graduating from high school in 1963, Rader enrolled at Kansas Wesleyan University in Salina, Kansas, where he studied administration of justice, an ironic choice that would later allow him to intimately understand the investigative methods used to hunt him. He was not a particularly notable college student, though he did join a campus organization and was remembered as somewhat socially awkward. During his time at Kansas Wesleyan, he also became involved with a local Methodist church, beginning a lifelong pattern of religious participation that would eventually become one of his most effective disguises. He graduated in 1965 with an associate degree and returned to Wichita, where he began looking for work and trying to establish himself as a functioning adult member of society. In 1966, Rader enlisted in the United States Air Force, a move that was common for young men of his generation seeking direction and stability. He was stationed at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas for basic training before being transferred to Shepherd Air Force Base, also in Texas, and eventually to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. During his 4 years of military service, Rader worked primarily as an aircraft mechanic and electrician, jobs that required precision, attention to detail, and the ability to follow rigid protocols. These skills would later serve him well in his criminal activities, allowing him to methodically plan and execute his crimes with meticulous care. While in the Air Force, Rader also developed what would become a defining characteristic of his adult life, an obsessive need for control and order. He kept detailed records, maintained strict routines, and exhibited a rigid personality that some of his fellow service members found mildly unsettling, though not to the degree that anyone suspected the dark fantasies simmering beneath the surface. In 1970, Rader was honorably discharged from the Air Force and returned to Wichita, where he moved back in with his parents and began the process of reintegrating into civilian life. He found work at a variety of jobs, including a stint at a nearby air conditioning company, where he demonstrated mechanical aptitude and reliability. It was also during this period that he began dating Paula Dietz, a quiet, reserved woman who attended the same church. The two married in 1971, and Paula had no inkling of the horrific violence that lurked behind her husband's mild-mannered facade. Their early married life appeared entirely normal to outside observers. Rader held down steady jobs, attended church regularly with his wife, and began to establish the reputation as a dependable, if somewhat dull, member of the community. In 1972, Rader enrolled at Wichita State University, where he would eventually earn a bachelor's degree in criminal justice in 1974. The study of criminal justice gave Rader an invaluable education in police procedures, evidence collection, forensic techniques, and the psychology of criminal investigation. He was, in essence, studying how to avoid capture while simultaneously pursuing a career that would place him in a position of public trust. During this period, Rader's violent fantasies, which had been with him since adolescence, began to intensify to the point where he felt an overwhelming compulsion to act on them. He later told investigators that he had spent years trying to resist these urges, engaging in what he called self-therapy, including writing down his fantasies and even drawing sketches of his imagined crimes in an attempt to purge them from his mind. But the self-therapy failed, and by the mid-1970s, Dennis Rader was ready to cross the threshold from fantasy into reality. On January 15, 1974, Rader committed his first known murder, targeting the Otero family at their home at 803 North Edgemore Street in Wichita. Joseph Otero was a 38-year-old retired Air Force sergeant who worked as an aircraft mechanic, and his wife Julie was 34 years old. They had 5 children, 2 of whom, Josephine, aged 11, and Joseph Jr., aged 9, were at home on the morning of January 15. Rader had been stalking the family for some time, having identified them as vulnerable targets in their modest, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood. He cut the phone lines to the house and then either forced his way inside or bluffed his way in, though the exact method of entry remained somewhat unclear because there were no surviving witnesses to the initial confrontation. What is clear is that Rader, armed with a handgun, quickly overpowered the family and began executing a plan he had rehearsed in his mind countless times. He bound Joseph Sr., Julie, and the 2 children with cord and tape, a method that would become his gruesome trademark. He then strangled Joseph Sr., using a ligature that he tightened with a handle, a technique he had researched and practiced. After killing the father, Rader strangled Julie in front of her children, then turned his attention to Joseph Jr., whom he also strangled. Finally, he took Josephine to the basement, where he hanged her from a sewer pipe, leaving her partially suspended in a grotesque tableau that investigators would later find. The murder of young Josephine revealed the full depth of Rader's sadism, as it became clear that sexual gratification derived from the suffering and helplessness of his victims was a primary motivator. After completing the murders, Rader locked the doors, left the house, and drove away, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror for the Otero's surviving children to discover when they returned home from school. The investigation into the Otero murders was one of the largest in Wichita's history at that time. Police descended on the neighborhood, conducting door-to-door interviews and collecting physical evidence. They found Rader's semen at the scene, though the technology to extract DNA profiles from such evidence did not yet exist. They also recovered fingerprints on various surfaces, though again, without a suspect to match them against, the prints were of limited immediate value. The brutality of the crime shocked the Wichita community to its core, and the Wichita Police Department mobilized significant resources to find the killer. Despite their efforts, the investigation stalled. Rader had been careful, leaving behind minimal evidence that could directly identify him, and he had no obvious connection to the Otero family that would have placed him on the investigators' radar. For more than 3 years, the case went cold, and the Otero murders joined the grim catalog of unsolved homicides that haunt every major police department. Rader, meanwhile, continued living his double life. In 1974, the same year he graduated from Wichita State and committed the Otero murders, he began working for the camping goods company Coleman, initially in an entry-level position. He proved to be a competent and reliable employee, and over the years he would be promoted several times, eventually rising to a supervisory role in the company's installation department. He and Paula also started a family, having a son, Brian, in 1975, and a daughter, Carrie, in 1978. Rader was, by all outward appearances, a devoted family man and a solid citizen. He coached his son's Little League baseball team, served as a Cub Scout leader, and was an active and visible member of Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, where he would eventually become president of the church council. This profound disconnect between Rader's public persona and his private monstrousness is what makes his case so chilling and what allowed him to evade capture for so long. The people who knew him as a church leader, a scoutmaster, and a compliance officer simply could not reconcile that man with the savage brutality of the BTK killer. On March 17, 1977, Rader struck again, this time targeting a 24-year-old woman named Shirley Vian. Rader had apparently been watching Vian, who lived in a house on South Hydraulic Street with her 2 young children and a male friend who was staying with them. On the morning of March 17, Rader knocked on the door, and when Vian answered, he forced his way inside at gunpoint. He locked the male friend and Vian's children in the bathroom, then bound Shirley Vian with cord and proceeded to strangle her using his signature ligature method. Unlike the Otero murders, this attack was not premeditated to the same degree. Rader later claimed that he had originally gone to the house with the intention of targeting a different person, but when that person was not home, he chose Vian as a substitute. This spontaneity terrified investigators, as it suggested the killer was becoming more brazen and less reliant on meticulous planning. After killing Vian, Rader left the house, and the children, who had been screaming and crying in the bathroom, eventually managed to break free and find a neighbor to call the police. The similarities between the Vian murder and the Otero murders were immediately apparent to investigators: the use of bindings, the ligature strangulation, the targeting of a victim in their own home. However, the police still lacked a suspect, and the connection between the two cases, while strongly suspected, was not yet publicly confirmed. Rader's compulsion to kill was driven not only by sadistic sexual gratification but also by an overwhelming need for recognition. He wanted the world to know what he had done, and he wanted to control the narrative. This need would eventually become his undoing, but in the short term, it led him to initiate communication with the authorities and the media. On April 28, 1977, a letter arrived at the Cake television station in Wichita. Written in a crude, disjointed style, the letter claimed responsibility for the Otero and Vian murders and included details that only the killer would know. The author of the letter gave himself a name, BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill. The letter was chilling not only for its content but for the sense it conveyed of a killer who was mocking the police and the community, a killer who believed he was smarter than everyone pursuing him. More letters followed, sent to newspapers, television stations, and eventually directly to the police department. In these letters, BTK described his crimes in graphic detail, provided drawings of his proposed methods, and outlined his twisted philosophy. He demanded attention and seemed to relish the fear his communications instilled in the Wichita community. The BTK letters transformed the case from a series of horrific but isolated murders into a citywide terror campaign. People in Wichita began locking their doors, checking their phone lines, and looking over their shoulders. The killer was no longer an abstract threat, he was a presence in their lives, communicating directly with them through the media. For the police, the letters were both a curse and a potential blessing. They provided insights into the killer's psychology and motivations, but they also allowed him to misdirect the investigation, feed false leads, and maintain a sense of control. Rader's next known murder occurred on December 8, 1977, when he killed Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman who lived alone in an apartment on South Independence Street. Rader broke into Fox's apartment while she was out, then waited for her to return. When she walked through the door, he confronted her, bound her, and strangled her. After the murder, Rader called the police from a payphone to report the crime, something he had never done before. This brazen act demonstrated his growing confidence and his need to directly interact with the investigation. The call was traced to a payphone at a downtown Wichita truck stop, but by the time police arrived, Rader was long gone. The Fox murder marked the end of what would later be identified as the first phase of BTK's killing spree. Following the Fox murder, Rader seemingly went dormant. For nearly a decade, there were no confirmed BTK murders, and the case gradually faded from the front pages of the Wichita newspapers. Investigators continued to work the case, following up on leads and analyzing the letters, but without new crimes to generate new evidence, progress was slow. During this dormant period, Rader continued to build his respectable public image. In 1985, he was hired by the city of Wichita as an enforcement officer for the Park and Recreation Department, a job that gave him a uniform, a badge, and a measure of authority. In this role, Rader was responsible for issuing citations for code violations, such as overgrown lawns, unlicensed dogs, and illegal parking. He drove a marked city vehicle through Wichita's neighborhoods, interacting with residents on a daily basis. The irony of a serial killer wearing a city uniform and enforcing community codes was lost on everyone at the time. Rader was reportedly good at his job, polite and professional in his interactions with the public, and well regarded by his supervisors. He was eventually promoted to a supervisor position, overseeing other enforcement officers. In 1991, he achieved another professional milestone when he was hired as a supervisor in the Compliance Department of Sedgwick County, a position that involved inspecting homes and businesses for code violations. This job gave Rader access to people's private residences, a privilege that he almost certainly found deeply satisfying given his predatory nature. He would knock on doors, announce himself as a county inspector, and be invited inside by trusting homeowners who had no idea they were letting a serial killer into their living rooms. Rader's ability to maintain this dual existence for so long is a testament to his extraordinary capacity for deception and compartmentalization. He was not a recluse or a social outcast, he was actively engaged with his community, his church, and his family, all while harboring a secret life of unimaginable violence. In January 1986, the BTK case exploded back into the public consciousness when Rader resumed his communication with the media. He sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle-Beacon newspaper that included a poem titled "Oh, Death to Nancy" and a photocopied image of what appeared to be a victim, later identified as Vicki Wegerle, a 28-year-old woman who had been strangled in her home on September 16, 1985. The inclusion of the Wegerle photo was a bombshell, as it connected a previously unsolved murder to the BTK case and proved that the killer was still active during the period when he was thought to be dormant. The Wegerle murder had initially been classified as a routine domestic homicide because there was no immediate evidence to suggest it was the work of a serial killer. But the BTK letter changed everything, forcing investigators to re-examine the case and eventually concluding that Wegerle was indeed a BTK victim. This revelation meant that the killer had been active more recently than previously believed and had been communicating with the public all along. Rader's communications during the 1980s and 1990s were sporadic but deeply unsettling. He sent packages to television stations containing items related to his crimes, including driver's licenses and other personal effects taken from his victims. He seemed to be taunting the police, daring them to catch him while simultaneously providing just enough information to keep himself relevant and the investigation alive. The psychological profile developed by the FBI's behavioral science unit during this period was remarkably accurate in many respects, describing the killer as an organized, intelligent, socially adequate white male in his late 20s to 30s who would likely have a job that involved some level of authority or public contact. The profile fit Rader almost perfectly, but with no suspect to apply it to, it remained a theoretical exercise. On April 4, 1986, Rader committed what would be his last known murder for nearly 2 decades. The victim was Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old woman who lived alone in Park City, a small suburb just north of Wichita. Rader broke into Hedge's home, abducted her, and took her to the basement of Christ Lutheran Church, the very church where he was an active and respected member. There, he bound and strangled her, then dumped her body in a rural area near Waco, Kansas. The choice of the church basement as a killing site was a grotesque demonstration of Rader's contempt for the community he pretended to serve and the faith he pretended to share. After the Hedge murder, Rader went silent again, and for 17 years, there were no confirmed BTK murders. The case became one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer investigations in American history, a source of frustration and embarrassment for the Wichita Police Department and a lingering source of fear for the community. Rader continued his life of quiet respectability during this period. His children grew up and moved away, he continued to advance in his career with Sedgwick County, and he remained active in his church. By the early 2000s, Dennis Rader was in his late 50s, a gray-haired, unremarkable-looking man who seemed to be heading toward a quiet retirement. But the compulsion that had driven him for decades had not disappeared. It was merely dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to reawaken. In early 2004, Rader began communicating again, sending letters to the Wichita Eagle that referenced old BTK crimes and seemed designed to reignite the media frenzy that had surrounded the case in the 1970s and 1980s. The timing of these communications was likely not coincidental. The 30th anniversary of the Otero murders was approaching, and Rader, who was obsessed with dates, anniversaries, and numerical patterns, seems to have felt the need to mark the occasion. He also may have been emboldened by the passage of time, believing that after 3 decades, he was truly beyond the reach of the law. What Rader did not anticipate was that the world of forensic science had transformed dramatically since his last active period. The most significant change was the development and widespread adoption of DNA profiling, a technology that did not exist when Rader committed his earliest murders. In March 2004, Rader sent a package to the KSAS television station in Wichita. The package contained a letter and, crucially, a floppy disk that Rader had used to compose the letter on his computer. This was a catastrophic error for Rader, who had always been meticulous about protecting his identity. Investigators who examined the floppy disk found that it contained metadata, including information about the document's author, which was listed as Christ Lutheran Church and included the name Dennis. This was the first direct link between the BTK communications and a specific individual. But the forensic breakthrough did not stop there. In May 2004, Rader sent another package, this time to the Wichita Police Department, that contained a series of items, including a photocopy of his driver's license and a letter that asked if it was possible to trace a floppy disk. This package also contained something that investigators had been desperately seeking for years, a DNA sample. Rader had included a piece of plastic tubing that he asked police to test, and forensic analysts were able to recover trace amounts of his DNA from the item. With the DNA from the package, investigators were able to conduct a familial DNA search, a technique that compares DNA profiles to identify close relatives of an unknown suspect. The search led them to a man named Dennis Rader, whose DNA profile was not in any criminal database but whose familial connections matched the BTK sample. To confirm the match, police conducted surveillance on Rader and obtained a DNA sample from him surreptitiously by collecting tissue from a pap smear taken from his daughter, Carrie, at a medical clinic. The daughter's DNA was a near-perfect match to the DNA recovered from the BTK crime scenes and communications, confirming that the killer was a close relative of Dennis Rader. On February 25, 2005, more than 30 years after the Otero murders, the Wichita Police Department, working with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, arrested Dennis Lynn Rader without incident at his home in Park City. When officers approached him, Rader asked them what took so long, a remark that revealed both his ego and his belief that he had been clever enough to evade capture indefinitely. He was taken into custody, and the news that the BTK killer had finally been caught sent shockwaves through Wichita and across the country. For the community, the horror was compounded by the revelation of who Rader was. The serial killer who had terrorized their city for decades was not a shadowy drifter or a monstrous stranger, he was the compliance officer who had inspected their homes, the scoutmaster who had led their children, the church council president who had sat beside them in the pews. The betrayal was profound and irreversible. The trial of Dennis Rader was not a contested proceeding in the traditional sense, as there was never any doubt about his guilt. Rader's attorney entered a guilty plea on June 27, 2005, to 10 counts of first-degree murder, covering the known BTK victims, Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Josephine Otero, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Vicki Wegerle, Maureen Hedge, Dolores Davis, and an 11th victim, Catherine Bright, whom Rader had attacked in April 1974, killing her and severely wounding her brother Kevin. The Bright case had not been initially linked to BTK but was later connected through Rader's confessions. During the sentencing hearing, which took place in August 2005, the court heard hours of gruesome testimony about each of the murders, much of it delivered by Rader himself. In a series of chilling, detached, and oddly clinical statements, Rader described in meticulous detail how he had planned and executed each murder. He spoke about his methods of breaking into homes, his techniques for binding and strangling his victims, and the sexual gratification he derived from their suffering. He showed no remorse, no emotion, and no recognition of the humanity of the people he had killed. For the families of the victims, hearing Rader describe the murders in such cold, mechanical terms was a form of torture in itself. Charlie Otero, the eldest son of Joseph and Julie Otero, delivered a devastating victim impact statement in which he described the lifetime of pain, anger, and loss that BTK had inflicted on his family. Other family members spoke of the decades of fear and uncertainty they had endured, not knowing who had killed their loved ones or whether the killer would strike again. On August 18, 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for 25 years on each count, effectively ensuring that he would die in prison. At the time of his sentencing, Kansas did not have the death penalty for murders committed before 1994, which meant that Rader was ineligible for capital punishment for most of his crimes. The absence of the death penalty was a source of anger and frustration for many in the Wichita community, who felt that Rader's crimes were so heinous that execution was the only appropriate punishment. The broader implications of the BTK case were significant and far-reaching. The investigation highlighted both the extraordinary advances in forensic science, particularly DNA technology, and the limitations of traditional policing when confronting a highly organized, intelligent offender. The case also raised profound questions about the nature of evil and the ability of monsters to hide in plain sight. Dennis Rader was not a genius, he was of above-average intelligence and possessed a chilling capacity for deception, but his ability to evade capture for 30 years was due as much to the limitations of the era's forensic technology as to his own cunning. The case also had a lasting impact on the Wichita community. For years, the city had lived in the shadow of BTK, and the revelation that the killer was one of their own deepened the wound. Trust, once broken so catastrophically, is not easily restored, and many residents found themselves looking at their neighbors, their co-workers, and their fellow church members with a newfound wariness. Dennis Rader is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he is serving his 10 consecutive life sentences. He has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television programs, and his case continues to fascinate and horrify true crime enthusiasts and criminal justice professionals alike. In recent years, Rader has continued to communicate with the outside world from prison, giving interviews and making statements that have provided further insight into his twisted psychology but have offered no genuine remorse or understanding of the suffering he caused. The legacy of BTK is a permanent scar on the city of Wichita, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are not always the ones lurking in the shadows, but sometimes the ones smiling at you from across the pew, inspecting your home for code violations, and coaching your children on the baseball field. The trust that Dennis Rader permanently broke in that community is a testament to the fact that evil does not always announce itself with horns and fire, sometimes it wears a uniform, carries a clipboard, and says grace before dinner. Number 2, John Skelton, a father who shattered the trust of a tight-knit Michigan community when his 3 young sons vanished, leaving behind a web of lies that investigators are still unraveling to this day. John Demetrius Skelton was born in 1969 and spent much of his adult life as a seemingly unremarkable man moving through the blue-collar landscapes of the American Midwest. He married Tanya Zuvers, and together they built a life in the small farming town of Morenci, Michigan, a community of roughly 2,300 people nestled along the Michigan-Ohio border where everyone knew their neighbors and the local school system served as the social anchor of daily life. John and Tanya had 3 sons together, Andrew, who was 9 years old at the time of the events, Alexander, who was 7, and Tanner, who was just 5. To the outside observer, the Skelton family appeared to embody the quiet, stable rhythms of small-town life. The boys were enrolled in the local elementary school, they participated in community activities, and their parents were recognized around town as a typical family navigating the ordinary challenges of raising 3 young children. However, beneath this surface of normalcy, the Skelton marriage was deteriorating. John and Tanya's relationship had become strained over the years, marked by arguments and a growing emotional distance that had not gone unnoticed by their friends and acquaintances. By the fall of 2010, the couple had separated, and Tanya had initiated divorce proceedings. The breakup was not amicable, and John was reportedly struggling to cope with the dissolution of his marriage and the prospect of losing daily access to his children. In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving of 2010, John Skelton's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning to those around him. He told several people that he had joined a group called the National Organization for Missing Children, an organization that, upon later investigation by law enforcement, was found not to exist. Skelton claimed that the group had trained him in covert operations and that he was working to protect children from various threats, but these claims were pure fabrications, the delusions of a man unraveling under the weight of his personal failures. He also began making vague and disturbing comments about the safety of his children, telling at least one person that he did not believe they were safe with their mother. These remarks were deeply alarming in hindsight, but at the time, they were not reported to authorities, a failure of communication that would haunt the Morenci community in the months and years to come. As Thanksgiving approached, a custody arrangement was negotiated between John and Tanya that allowed John to have the three boys for the holiday weekend. On Wednesday, November 24, 2010, John picked up Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner from Tanya's home, and they drove to John's residence in Morenci. This was the last time Tanya Zuvers would ever see her sons alive. The following day, Thanksgiving, John Skelton failed to appear at a prearranged location to drop the boys off to their mother as scheduled. Tanya tried repeatedly to contact John by phone, but her calls went unanswered. As the hours passed and there was no word from John or the children, Tanya's concern escalated into panic, and she contacted the Morenci Police Department to report her sons missing. When police arrived at John Skelton's home to inquire about the boys, they found Skelton alone. He told the officers a series of stories that were immediately inconsistent and deeply suspicious. Initially, he claimed that he had given the boys to an unidentified woman named Joanne Taylor, who he said was a member of the fictitious National Organization for Missing Children. According to Skelton, Joanne Taylor had come to his home, taken the boys, and driven away with them, ostensibly to keep them safe. When pressed for details about this woman, Skelton could provide no physical description beyond the most generic information, no phone number, no address, and no vehicle description. He claimed that the organization operated in secret and that its members communicated through covert channels, making it impossible for him to provide verifiable information about Joanne Taylor or the boys' whereabouts. The police, naturally, were deeply skeptical of this story, and their skepticism only deepened as they began to investigate Skelton's claims. A search for Joanne Taylor yielded nothing. No person by that name could be found in any database, no organization matching Skelton's description existed anywhere in the country, and no physical evidence of the woman's presence at Skelton's home could be identified. In the days that followed, Skelton's story began to shift and morph in ways that further eroded whatever slim credibility he might have had. He offered several different accounts of what had happened to the boys, each one contradicting the last. At one point, he suggested that the boys had been taken out of state by members of the organization. At another point, he implied that they had been placed in a safe house. He even floated the idea that he had hidden the boys himself to protect them from an unspecified threat involving their mother, though he provided absolutely no evidence to support any of these claims. The constantly shifting narratives were a classic hallmark of deception, and investigators quickly concluded that John Skelton was lying about what had happened to his sons. As the search for Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner expanded, the resources devoted to the case grew exponentially. The Morenci Police Department was joined by the Michigan State Police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and numerous local volunteer organizations. Hundreds of volunteers from Morenci and the surrounding communities combed fields, woods, ditches, and abandoned buildings in a desperate search for any sign of the missing boys. Search and rescue teams used dogs, helicopters, and ATVs to cover miles of rugged terrain in the cold, late November weather. Divers searched local ponds, rivers, and waterways, dragging the bottoms in areas where a body might have been concealed. The search was one of the largest and most intensive in Michigan's history, and it dominated the local and regional news cycle for weeks. But despite the massive deployment of personnel and resources, not a single trace of the boys was ever found. No clothing, no personal belongings, no biological evidence, nothing that could confirm whether the boys were alive or dead. This absence of physical evidence was both maddening and telling. In cases where children are abducted by strangers, there is often some kind of trace, a witness who saw something, a piece of clothing found by the side of the road, a suspicious vehicle caught on a security camera. But in the Skelton case, there was nothing, which led investigators to the grim conclusion that the person responsible for the boys' disappearance was someone who had complete control over them in their final hours, someone who had the opportunity to plan and execute their removal without leaving a trace. That person was John Skelton. On November 30, 2010, 6 days after the boys were last seen, John Skelton was arrested on charges of parental kidnapping. He was taken into custody without incident and lodged in the Lenawee County Jail. During his incarceration, Skelton continued to maintain his innocence and to offer vague, unhelpful explanations for the boys' disappearance, but he never provided any concrete information that could lead to their recovery. Investigators conducted exhaustive interviews with Skelton, hoping to break through his wall of deception and extract the truth, but Skelton remained steadfast in his lies, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for evasion and obfuscation that frustrated even the most experienced interrogators. The forensic investigation of Skelton's home and vehicles yielded disturbing but not conclusive evidence. In Skelton's home, investigators found a journal in which Skelton had written entries that revealed his increasingly paranoid and distorted state of mind in the weeks leading up to the boys' disappearance. The entries referenced the fictitious organization, expressed fear for the boys' safety, and contained vague allusions to a plan to remove them from their mother's care. The journal did not contain a direct confession, but it provided a window into the mind of a man who was constructing a self-justifying narrative for an act he had not yet committed or was in the process of planning. Forensic analysis of Skelton's vehicle revealed traces of what appeared to be cleaning agents, which suggested that the interior of the vehicle had been thoroughly wiped down, an action that investigators interpreted as an attempt to destroy evidence. There were also faint traces of blood found in the vehicle, though the amount was too small to yield a DNA profile that could confirm it belonged to any of the boys. This forensic evidence was circumstantial but highly damaging to Skelton's already tenuous credibility. The legal proceedings against John Skelton were complex and fraught with challenges, the most significant of which was the absence of the boys' bodies. In the American legal system, proving a murder case without a body is extraordinarily difficult, as prosecutors must overcome the reasonable doubt that naturally arises when the victim's fate cannot be physically confirmed. The Lenawee County Prosecutor's Office, led by Prosecutor Burton Castle, made the decision to charge Skelton not with murder but with 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment, a charge that did not require proof of death but carried a significant prison sentence. The decision to pursue unlawful imprisonment rather than murder charges was controversial, with some members of the public and the media arguing that the evidence clearly pointed to murder and that Skelton should be charged accordingly. However, the prosecutors determined that the unlawful imprisonment charges gave them the strongest chance of securing a conviction, given the constraints of the available evidence. The trial of John Skelton began on April 2, 2012, in Lenawee County Circuit Court, more than a year after the boys' disappearance. The prosecution presented a meticulously constructed case that relied on circumstantial evidence, Skelton's own inconsistent statements, and the testimony of witnesses who painted a picture of a man who was desperate, delusional, and capable of great deception. The prosecution's theory was straightforward: John Skelton, unable to cope with the dissolution of his marriage and the loss of custody of his children, had murdered his 3 sons and disposed of their bodies in a manner that has thus far defied all efforts at recovery. The prosecution called numerous witnesses, including Tanya Zuvers, who testified about the deterioration of her marriage and the events surrounding the boys' disappearance. Friends and acquaintances of Skelton testified about his increasingly bizarre behavior in the weeks before Thanksgiving, including his claims about the non-existent organization. Law enforcement officers testified about the investigation, the search for Joanne Taylor, and the forensic evidence recovered from Skelton's home and vehicle. The defense, represented by attorney Ray Jerdal, took a markedly different approach. Jerdal did not attempt to argue that Skelton's stories about Joanne Taylor and the missing children's organization were true, as the evidence against those stories was overwhelming. Instead, the defense argued that the prosecution had not met its burden of proof, that the circumstantial evidence was insufficient to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Skelton had harmed his children. The defense suggested that the boys might have been taken by someone else, that Skelton's lies were the product of mental illness rather than guilt, and that the absence of physical evidence, most critically the absence of the boys' bodies, meant that the truth of what happened to Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner remained unknown. The defense's argument, while legally sound, struck many observers as morally repugnant, as it required the jury to believe that 3 young boys had simply vanished from the face of the earth without a trace and that their father's elaborate web of lies was merely a coincidence. On April 16, 2012, after less than a day of deliberation, the jury found John Skelton guilty on all 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and frustration by the community, relief that Skelton had been held accountable for something, and frustration that he had not been convicted of the murder that most people believed he had committed. On June 14, 2012, Judge Margaret No sentenced Skelton to 15 to 45 years in prison on each count, with the sentences to be served concurrently, meaning that Skelton would not be eligible for parole until he had served at least 15 years. The sentencing hearing was an emotionally raw proceeding, with Tanya Zuvers delivering a victim impact statement in which she described the unrelenting agony of not knowing what happened to her sons, of living every day with the hope that they might be found alive and the dread that they would not. Members of the Morenci community also spoke, expressing the profound sense of betrayal and loss that the case had inflicted on their town. Judge No, in imposing the sentence, acknowledged the limitations of the justice system in a case like this, noting that no sentence could adequately address the magnitude of the crime or the suffering of the victim's family. The aftermath of the Skelton case has been defined by an agonizing and seemingly endless search for the truth. Despite the conviction, the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office and the Michigan State Police have never closed the investigation into the disappearance of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton. Over the years, investigators have followed up on hundreds of tips, conducted additional searches of areas of interest, and utilized advancing forensic technologies in the hope of finding the boys' remains. These efforts have included ground-penetrating radar surveys of locations associated with Skelton, searches of rural properties in Michigan and neighboring Ohio, and consultations with forensic experts from across the country. Investigators have also interviewed Skelton repeatedly during his incarceration, hoping that time and the reality of his sentence might erode his resolve and prompt him to reveal the location of the boys' bodies. Skelton, however, has remained largely silent, offering no new information and providing no closure to the family or the community. There have been occasional reports of Skelton making vague, ambiguous statements to other inmates or to visitors, but none of these statements have led to the recovery of the boys' remains. The case has also attracted the attention of private investigators, volunteer search groups, and true crime enthusiasts, all of whom have contributed to the ongoing effort to find the boys, but despite this collective effort, the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. The impact of the Skelton case on the Morenci community has been profound and enduring. In a town where everyone knows everyone, the disappearance of 3 children was not just a news story, it was a personal catastrophe that affected every resident in some way. The trust that had once characterized social interactions in Morenci was shattered, replaced by a lingering sense of vulnerability and suspicion. Parents became hyper-vigilant about their children's safety, and the community's sense of innocence, fragile as it may have been in the modern era, was irretrievably lost. The case also had a significant impact on the way child custody disputes are handled in the region, prompting discussions about the need for more rigorous risk assessment in cases where one parent exhibits signs of mental instability or potential violence. The Skelton case is a harrowing reminder that the most unimaginable crimes are not always committed by strangers in dark alleys but sometimes by the people who are closest to the victims, the people who are supposed to protect them. John Skelton was a father, a role that carries with it the most fundamental obligation of care and protection, and he violated that obligation in the most absolute and horrifying way imaginable. The fact that he has never revealed what he did with his sons, that he has denied their mother and their community even the grim closure of knowing where their bodies are, is a final act of cruelty that compounds the horror of the original crime. As of today, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton remain missing, their faces frozen in time on missing persons posters and in the memories of those who loved them. John Skelton remains incarcerated, serving his sentence and carrying a secret that the Morenci community, and the world, may never fully uncover. The case stands as one of the most disturbing in modern American criminal history, not because of its violence or its gore, but because of the cold, calculated betrayal at its heart, the betrayal of 3 little boys by the one person in the world they had every reason to trust. Number 3, Faye Copeland, who alongside her husband Ray, murdered at least 5 drifters on their Missouri farm in a killing spree that exploited the invisible underclass of transient farm workers and permanently shattered the illusion of safety in a rural American community. Faye Wilson was born on August 1, 1921, in the tiny town of Farmersville, Missouri, a speck on the map in the state's rugged Ozarks region where life was defined by hard work, scarce resources, and the close-knit if sometimes suffocating bonds of rural existence. She grew up in deep poverty, one of many children in a family that struggled to feed itself during the Great Depression, an experience that instilled in her a lifelong preoccupation with financial security and a deep-seated fear of destitution. As a young woman, Faye was considered plain and quiet, not the kind of person who drew attention to herself in any way. She married young, as was common in that era and region, but her first marriage ended in divorce, a status that carried significant social stigma in mid-century rural Missouri and left Faye in a precarious position both economically and socially. In the late 1960s, Faye met Ray Copeland, a man 14 years her senior who had spent his entire life drifting through the margins of society. Ray Copeland was born in 1914 in Oklahoma and had been a transient for as long as anyone could remember, a man who moved from town to town, state to state, taking odd jobs as a farmhand, a mechanic, or a laborer whenever he could find them. Ray had a long criminal history that included arrests for theft, forgery, and fraud, and he had spent time in various county jails and state prisons across the Midwest. He was a con artist at heart, a smooth-talking schemer who could charm his way into a person's confidence just long enough to rob them blind. He was also, by all accounts, a bully and a manipulator who preyed on those who were weaker or more vulnerable than himself. When Ray and Faye married in 1968, they settled on a modest farm near Chillicothe, Missouri, a small agricultural community in the north-central part of the state. The Copeland farm was not a prosperous operation. The land was poor, the buildings were decrepit, and the couple lacked the resources, the equipment, and arguably the work ethic to make a success of commercial farming. But Ray Copeland had no intention of making an honest living from the soil. Instead, he developed a criminal scheme that was as simple as it was diabolical, a scheme that relied on the invisibility of the transient workforce that circulated through rural America in the late 20th century. The scheme worked like this: Ray would place advertisements in local newspapers or visit homeless shelters and labor pools in nearby cities, looking for hired hands to work on his farm. He would specifically target drifters, transients, and itinerant workers, men who had no fixed address, no family in the area, and no one who would notice or care if they suddenly disappeared. When a drifter arrived at the Copeland farm, Ray would put him to work for a few days or weeks, treating him reasonably well to build trust. Then, Ray would take the drifter to a local livestock auction or a farm supply store and have him sign a check made out to Ray Copeland, using a checking account that Ray had opened in the drifter's name using forged identification documents that Ray had obtained or fabricated. Ray would then cash the check, pocket the money, and dispose of the drifter. The beauty of the scheme, from Ray's perspective, was that the paper trail led to a person who did not exist or who would never come forward to report the fraud, and the victim, being a transient with no ties to the community, was unlikely to be missed. This scheme required the active complicity of Faye Copeland, a fact that has been the subject of intense debate among criminal psychologists, legal scholars, and true crime writers for decades. The question of Faye's culpability is at the heart of the Copeland case and is what makes it such a disturbing study in the dynamics of abusive relationships and the capacity for ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. The evidence suggests that Faye was not a willing or enthusiastic participant in the murders but rather a terrified woman who was psychologically and physically dominated by a controlling, violent husband. Ray Copeland was a classic domestic abuser, a man who used intimidation, isolation, and the threat of violence to control every aspect of Faye's life. He kept her on the farm, cut off from friends and family, and instilled in her a pervasive fear of him that rendered her incapable of resisting his demands. Faye was in her late 60s by the time the murders began, a small, frail woman with a limited education and no resources of her own. She was, in every meaningful sense, trapped. The first known victim of the Copeland killing scheme was a drifter named Jack McCormick, who disappeared in 1986. McCormick was a middle-aged man with a history of alcoholism and transient living, the exact profile that Ray Copeland sought out. McCormick came to the Copeland farm to work, and within a short period, he vanished. No one reported him missing, and no investigation was launched. His body has never been found. The second known victim was Robert Harrison, who disappeared in 1988. Harrison, like McCormick, was a transient farm worker who had been lured to the Copeland farm with the promise of employment. He also vanished without a trace, and his body has never been recovered. The third known victim was John Freeman, who disappeared in 1989. Freeman was a younger man, in his 20s, who had been working his way through the Midwest doing farm labor. He arrived at the Copeland farm in the summer of 1989 and was never seen again. Like McCormick and Harrison, Freeman's body has never been found. The fourth known victim was Dennis Murphy, who also disappeared in 1989. Murphy was a drifter from Nebraska who had been working in the Chillicothe area when he was recruited by Ray Copeland. He vanished after going to the Copeland farm, and his body has never been recovered. The fifth known victim, and the one whose disappearance finally brought the Copeland killing machine to a halt, was Wayne Warner, a 23-year-old drifter from Wisconsin who had been working on farms in northern Missouri. Warner arrived at the Copeland farm in October 1989, and within days, he was dead. Unlike the previous victims, however, Warner's disappearance did not go completely unnoticed. Warner had a friend, another transient named Paul Field, who knew that Warner had gone to work at the Copeland farm and who became concerned when he did not return. Field went to the authorities and reported Warner missing, providing information about where Warner had last been seen. This report triggered an investigation that would ultimately expose the full horror of what had been happening on the Copeland farm. When Livingston County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Copeland farm to inquire about Wayne Warner, they found Ray and Faye living in conditions of extreme squalor and neglect. The farmhouse was filthy, cluttered with trash and debris, and infested with vermin. Ray Copeland was initially cooperative, telling the deputies that Warner had worked on the farm for a few days and then left, claiming that he did not know where the young man had gone. Faye Copeland was also present during the interview, and deputies noticed that she appeared to be extremely nervous and subdued, deferring to Ray in almost every interaction and avoiding eye contact with the officers. The deputies' initial visit did not yield any evidence of foul play, but the investigation continued, and as detectives dug deeper into Ray Copeland's background, they began to uncover a pattern of financial fraud that was strikingly similar across multiple cases. They discovered that Ray had opened checking accounts in the names of several men who had subsequently disappeared, and they found canceled checks bearing the signatures of these men that had been cashed at local businesses. The financial trail was damning, but without bodies, the case against the Copelands was circumstantial. The breakthrough came in the fall of 1990, more than a year after Wayne Warner's disappearance, when a farmhand named Jerry Hutchins, who had worked for the Copelands and who had been pressured by Ray to sign a check made out to Ray, went to the authorities and told them everything he knew about the scheme. Hutchins described how Ray had taken him to a bank, had him sign checks, and had then threatened him when Hutchins realized that something illegal was going on. Hutchins's testimony gave investigators the framework they needed to understand the full scope of the Copeland operation, and it provided the probable cause necessary to obtain a search warrant for the Copeland farm. On November 12, 1990, a team of investigators from the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and the FBI descended on the Copeland farm and began a meticulous search of the property. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In a barn on the property, investigators discovered a gruesome collection of human remains. 5 bodies were found in the barn, each one wrapped in a tarp or a blanket and positioned in a manner that suggested they had been stored there for an extended period. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, making immediate visual identification impossible, but forensic analysis later confirmed that the remains were those of Jack McCormick, Robert Harrison, John Freeman, Dennis Murphy, and Wayne Warner. The condition of the bodies indicated that each victim had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, an execution-style killing that spoke to the cold, methodical nature of the crimes. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a multiple murder prosecution, and Ray and Faye Copeland were arrested on the spot. During their subsequent interrogations, the two suspects offered starkly different accounts of what had happened. Ray Copeland denied everything, claiming that the bodies had been on the property when he moved in and that he had nothing to do with the murders. This defense was so transparently absurd that it was almost comical, and investigators dismissed it immediately. Faye Copeland's response was far more complex and revealing. She initially denied any knowledge of the murders, but as the interrogation progressed and the evidence against them mounted, she began to crack. Faye eventually told investigators that Ray had killed all 5 men and that she had been too afraid of him to intervene or go to the police. She claimed that Ray had threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone what he had done, and she said that she had lived in constant terror of him for years. She admitted that she had helped Ray with the check fraud scheme, writing letters to the banks to open the accounts and handling some of the paperwork, but she maintained that she had not participated in the actual killings and had not known that Ray was going to murder the men until after the fact. The question of Faye's precise role in the murders became the central issue of the case, and it was a question that would never be fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction. The physical evidence was ambiguous when it came to assigning specific roles to each of the Copelands. The gun that was used to kill all 5 victims was found in the house, and it was not possible to determine who had pulled the trigger in each instance. There was no forensic evidence, such as DNA or fingerprints, that placed Faye at the scene of any of the actual shootings. However, the bodies had been wrapped, moved, and stored in the barn, tasks that would have been physically impossible for Ray to accomplish alone, given the condition of some of the remains and the logistics of moving 5 adult bodies into a barn and concealing them under tarps. This logistical reality strongly suggested that Faye had assisted Ray in the aftermath of the killings, even if she did not pull the trigger herself. The legal proceedings against Ray and Faye Copeland were separated, with each defendant being tried individually. Ray Copeland's trial took place first, in the spring of 1991, and it was a relatively straightforward proceeding. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Ray's guilt, including the bodies found on his property, the forged checks in the victims' names, the testimony of Jerry Hutchins, and Ray's own lengthy criminal history. The defense offered little in the way of a coherent alternative theory, and on March 7, 1991, the jury convicted Ray Copeland on 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. Faye Copeland's trial, which took place in the summer of 1991, was a far more nuanced and emotionally charged affair. The prosecution argued that Faye was a willing participant in the murder scheme, pointing to her involvement in the check fraud, her knowledge of the bodies in the barn, and the logistical evidence that suggested she had helped Ray move and conceal the remains. The prosecution painted Faye not as a passive victim of domestic abuse but as an active accomplice who had chosen to participate in the scheme for financial gain. The defense, led by attorney Richard Franks, mounted a vigorous argument that Faye was a battered woman who had been coerced into participating in the crimes by a violently abusive husband. They presented evidence of Ray's history of domestic violence, including testimony from people who had witnessed Ray threatening and intimidating Faye over the years. They argued that Faye's actions, including her involvement in the check fraud and her assistance in concealing the bodies, were the result of duress and coercion, not free will. The defense also called expert witnesses in the field of battered woman syndrome, who testified that Faye's behavior, including her failure to report the crimes or flee from her husband, was entirely consistent with the psychological profile of a woman who had been subjected to prolonged domestic abuse. The jury, however, was not persuaded by the defense's arguments. On August 10, 1991, Faye Copeland was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder, making her, at 69 years old, the oldest woman in the United States at that time to be sentenced to death. The verdict was controversial and sparked a national debate about the criminal justice system's treatment of battered women and the distinction between coerced participation and willing complicity in criminal acts. Advocates for battered women argued that Faye's conviction was a miscarriage of justice, that she had been punished for surviving an abusive marriage rather than for committing murder. Others argued that the evidence of her involvement was sufficient to sustain the convictions and that the jury had made the right call. The legal battles continued for years after the trial, with Faye's appeals winding their way through the state and federal court systems. In 1999, the Missouri Supreme Court upheld Faye's convictions but reduced her sentence from death to life in prison, citing her age and the mitigating circumstances of her abusive marriage. By the time the court issued its ruling, Faye was 78 years old and in failing health. Ray Copeland, meanwhile, had died on death row in 1993 of natural causes, cheating the executioner and depriving the families of his victims of the closure that a state-sanctioned death might have provided. Faye Copeland spent the remaining years of her life in the Chillicothe Correctional Center, a women's prison in northwestern Missouri. She was a model prisoner, quiet and unassuming, spending her time reading and corresponding with a small number of people who had taken an interest in her case. She maintained, until the end of her life, that she had not killed anyone and that everything she had done had been done under the threat of death from her husband. On December 23, 2003, Faye Copeland died in prison at the age of 82, having served 12 years of her life sentence. She was buried in a prison cemetery, her grave marked only by a number, a quiet and ignominious end to a life that had been defined by poverty, abuse, and an encounter with evil that she was never able to fully explain or escape. The Copeland case left a deep and lasting scar on the Chillicothe community and on the broader rural Missouri region. The revelation that a seemingly ordinary farm couple had been murdering transient workers and burying their bodies in a barn for years, with no one noticing, was a profound shock to a community that prided itself on knowing its neighbors and looking out for one another. The case exposed the dark underbelly of the transient agricultural workforce. A world of rootless, vulnerable men who moved through rural America largely invisible to the mainstream society around them. These were men who fell through every crack in the social safety net, men whose disappearances were noticed by no one because no one had any reason to notice them. The Copelands had exploited this invisibility with cold and calculated precision, preying on the most vulnerable members of the rural community for financial gain. The case also forced a difficult and uncomfortable conversation about the nature of domestic abuse and the limits of the battered woman syndrome defense. Faye Copeland's conviction, and the subsequent reduction of her sentence, highlighted the tension between the legal system's need to assign individual responsibility for criminal acts and the psychological reality of coercive control, a reality that can render a person functionally incapable of resisting an abuser's demands even when those demands involve participation in the most horrific crimes imaginable. The families of the victims were left to grapple with the knowledge that their loved ones had been murdered, stripped of their identities even in death by the theft of their names for financial fraud, and discarded in a barn like so much refuse. The fact that some of the victims' families had not even known their loved ones were dead until the bodies were found added an additional layer of anguish to an already unbearable situation. The Copeland farm itself became a kind of macabre landmark, a place that people drove past slowly, staring at the decrepit buildings and the overgrown fields, trying to comprehend how such ordinary-looking surroundings could have concealed such extraordinary evil. Eventually, the farm was sold, and the barn where the bodies had been found was torn down, but the memory of what happened there lingers in the collective consciousness of the community like a stain that cannot be washed away. The case of Ray and Faye Copeland remains one of the most disturbing in the annals of American true crime, not because of the number of victims or the sensational nature of the crimes, but because of the quiet, mundane, almost banal way in which the evil was carried out. There was no dramatic standoff, no elaborate cat-and-mouse game with the police, no manifesto or philosophical justification. It was just a greedy, abusive man and his terrified wife, exploiting the most vulnerable people they could find, killing them in the most efficient way possible, and hiding the evidence in a barn, all for a few $1,000s in forged checks. It was evil at its most pedestrian and therefore at its most terrifying, a reminder that the greatest horrors are not always accompanied by thunder and lightning but sometimes unfold in silence on a rundown farm in the middle of nowhere, invisible to the world until someone finally bothers to look. Number 4, Patrice Alston, a woman who shattered the peaceful facade of her small Indiana community by murdering her husband, a devoted local pastor, inside their own home in a crime that exposed a web of deception and left a congregation reeling from an unfathomable betrayal. Patrice Alston, born in the early 1970s, lived much of her life in and around Anderson, Indiana, a mid-sized city surrounded by the smaller, close-knit towns of Madison County where church life often served as the primary social fabric holding neighborhoods together. Anderson itself had seen economic struggles over the decades, transitioning from a bustling industrial hub to a community grappling with the aftermath of manufacturing decline, but its churches remained vibrant, serving as anchors of stability, hope, and communal trust. It was within this deeply religious environment that Patrice met and eventually married Reverend William Alston, a man who had dedicated his life to serving God and his congregation. William Alston was not a flashy televangelist or a distant religious figure, he was a grassroots pastor who worked intimately with his flock, visiting the sick, counseling the troubled, and opening his home to those in need. He led a local church in the Anderson area, and his reputation was one of genuine kindness, humility, and an unwavering commitment to his faith. To the outside world, the Alstons appeared to be a solid, God-fearing couple, united in their mission to serve their community. Patrice played the role of the pastor's wife, attending services, participating in church events, and projecting an image of devotion and contentment that perfectly complemented her husband's ministry. However, beneath this carefully curated exterior, the Alston marriage was fracturing in ways that few people close to the couple fully understood. In the years leading up to the murder, the relationship between Patrice and William had deteriorated significantly. While the exact details of their private struggles remained largely confined within the walls of their home, those who knew them well began to notice subtle shifts in their dynamic. There were whispered rumors of financial stress, disagreements about the direction of the church, and a growing emotional distance between the couple. Some friends and congregation members later recalled that Patrice seemed increasingly unhappy and withdrawn in the months before the crime, though no one could have predicted the extreme violence that this unhappiness would produce. The pressures of being a pastor's wife, a role that carries immense but often unspoken expectations regarding behavior, public image, and selfless service, may have contributed to Patrice's mounting resentment. She was expected to be a pillar of support for her husband and an example for the congregation, a burden that can become suffocating when the underlying marriage is crumbling. As the tensions within the marriage escalated, Patrice Alston began to formulate a plan that was as calculated as it was horrific. Instead of seeking a divorce or finding another way out of her unhappy situation, she decided to end William's life, a decision that would forever alter the lives of everyone who knew them and would permanently scar the community they had both sworn to serve. On the morning of the murder, the Alston home, which should have been a place of peace and spiritual refuge, became the site of an execution. Patrice attacked William, using a weapon to inflict fatal injuries that ended his life in a brutal and deliberate manner. The specifics of the attack, as revealed during the subsequent investigation and trial, painted a picture not of a sudden loss of control or a crime of passion, but of a premeditated act committed by a woman who had made a conscious decision to kill her husband. After the attack, Patrice did not immediately call for help or surrender to the authorities. Instead, she attempted to stage the scene and construct a narrative that would deflect suspicion away from herself, a common but often flawed tactic employed by those who kill someone close to them. When law enforcement officers from the Anderson Police Department and the Madison County Sheriff's Department arrived at the Alston home in response to an emergency call, they found William Alston dead and Patrice present, offering a version of events that was immediately suspect. The investigators, trained to look for inconsistencies in the statements of those closest to a victim, quickly identified discrepancies in Patrice's account of what had happened. The physical evidence at the scene, including blood spatter patterns, the position of the body, and the location of the weapon, contradicted key elements of her story. Furthermore, the nature of William's injuries did not align with the scenario Patrice had described. It became clear to the detectives within hours of their arrival that they were not dealing with a home invasion, an accidental death, or a suicide, but with a homicide, and that the person most likely responsible for that homicide was the victim's wife. Patrice Alston was taken into custody and transported to the Madison County Jail, where she was formally charged with the murder of her husband. The news of William Alston's death and Patrice's arrest sent a shockwave through the Anderson community that was felt far beyond the walls of their church. William Alston was not just a pastor, he was a spiritual leader, a counselor, a friend, and a father figure to dozens of people who had turned to him in their darkest moments. The idea that he had been murdered, not by a stranger or a criminal, but by the woman he had pledged his life to, was almost incomprehensible to those who knew and loved him. The congregation was thrown into a state of profound grief and confusion, struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the violent manner of his death. The investigation into William's murder revealed a more complex and troubling picture of Patrice Alston than the one she had presented to the world. Detectives delved into her background, her finances, and her personal relationships, looking for a motive that could explain such a drastic and violent act. What they found suggested that Patrice's motivations were a toxic mixture of resentment, financial pressure, and a desire to escape a life that she felt had trapped her. There were indications that the marriage had been troubled for a significantly longer period than most people realized, and that Patrice had been living a double life of sorts, projecting contentment to the outside world while seething with anger and frustration in private. The financial records examined by investigators showed that the Alstons were under significant monetary stress, a common factor in domestic violence cases, though the exact nature of the financial problems was not made entirely public out of respect for the family's privacy. The prosecution of Patrice Alston was handled by the Madison County Prosecutor's Office, which faced the challenging task of presenting a coherent and compelling case to a jury that was inevitably influenced by the victim's status as a pastor and the defendant's status as his wife. The trial took place in the Madison County Superior Court, where the courtroom was packed with spectators, including many members of William Alston's congregation who wanted to see justice served for their beloved pastor. The prosecution presented a methodical case that began with the crime scene evidence, which firmly contradicted Patrice's initial statements to the police. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence and the mechanics of the fatal injuries, establishing that the crime could not have happened in the way Patrice had described. The prosecution then introduced evidence of the underlying tensions in the marriage, including testimony from friends and family members who described the deteriorating relationship and Patrice's growing dissatisfaction. The prosecution's narrative was clear and direct. Patrice Alston, unhappy in her marriage and unwilling to endure it any longer, had planned and executed the murder of her husband, then lied to the police in an attempt to cover up her crime. The defense, while acknowledging the tensions in the marriage, attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's theory of premeditation. They argued that the crime was the result of a volatile domestic dispute that had escalated out of control, a distinction that could have resulted in a lesser charge such as voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The defense also sought to humanize Patrice, portraying her as a woman who had been under immense pressure and who had reached a breaking point. However, the physical evidence and Patrice's own lies to the police severely undermined the defense's efforts. The jury, after hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the forensic evidence, found Patrice Alston guilty of murder. The judge, recognizing the premeditated and particularly callous nature of the crime, sentenced her to 60 years in the Indiana Department of Correction, a sentence that reflected the severity of the offense and the profound loss suffered by the victim's family and community. Patrice Alston was transported to the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis to begin serving her sentence, leaving behind a community that was still struggling to process the enormity of what had happened. The aftermath of the crime was a period of deep soul-searching for the Anderson community and for William Alston's congregation in particular. The church, which had lost its leader in the most violent and traumatic way imaginable, faced the daunting task of healing and rebuilding. Some members left the church, unable to overcome the association between the building and the horrific event that had taken place. Others rallied together, drawing on their faith to sustain them through the grief and confusion. A new pastor was eventually brought in to lead the congregation, but the shadow of William Alston's murder hung over the church for years, a painful reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of hidden sin. The case also prompted a broader conversation within the local religious community about the pressures faced by clergy families and the need for better support systems for pastors and their spouses. The role of the pastor's wife, in particular, came under scrutiny, as people began to recognize that the expectations placed on these women, expectations of perfection, selfless service, and unwavering support, could create an environment where emotional and psychological struggles were suppressed until they erupted in destructive ways. Many churches in the area began to implement more formal counseling and support programs for clergy families, recognizing that the spiritual health of a congregation is intimately connected to the personal well-being of its leaders. For the family of William Alston, the pain of his loss was compounded by the manner of his death and the person responsible for it. Losing a loved one to violence is always devastating, but losing a loved one to violence perpetrated by their spouse adds a layer of betrayal and incomprehension that makes the grieving process even more difficult. The Alston family had to navigate the criminal justice system, endure the media attention, and try to find a way to honor William's memory while coming to terms with the fact that the woman he had trusted with his life had taken it from him. Patrice Alston remains incarcerated in the Indiana prison system, serving her 60-year sentence. She has been denied appeals, and it is highly unlikely that she will ever be released, a reality that brings a measure of cold comfort to those who loved William Alston and who were devastated by his murder. The case of Patrice Alston is a deeply disturbing study in the destruction of trust within a small community. William Alston was a man who had devoted his life to building trust, to creating a space where people could feel safe, supported, and spiritually nourished. His wife exploited that trust, using the intimacy and privacy of their marriage to conceal her growing rage and then to carry out his murder. The community that had trusted the Alstons as a couple was forced to confront the fact that the most dangerous person in William's life was not a stranger, not a criminal, not an enemy of the faith, but the woman who shared his bed, sat beside him in the pew, and smiled at his congregation every Sunday. The betrayal was total and irreversible, a fracture in the community's sense of safety and trust that has never fully healed. It is a case that serves as a grim reminder that evil does not always come from outside the walls of our homes and churches. Sometimes it is born within them, nurtured by resentment and desperation, and unleashed in a moment of calculated violence that destroys everything it touches. In Anderson, Indiana, the name William Alston is still spoken with reverence and sadness, a reminder of a good man whose life was cut short by the one person he should have been able to trust above all others, and the name Patrice Alston is spoken with a mixture of disbelief and condemnation, a reminder that the most horrifying crimes are often committed not by monsters in the dark, but by the people sitting next to us in the light. Number 5, Gordon Stewart Northcott, a man whose unspeakable crimes against children on a remote chicken ranch in rural California during the late 1920s not only horrified the nation but also exposed the devastating consequences of a community's willingness to look away from the suffering of the vulnerable. Gordon Stewart Northcott was born on November 9, 1906, in Bladworth, Saskatchewan, Canada, to George Cyrus Northcott and Sarah Louise Northcott. The Northcott family was deeply dysfunctional, plagued by poverty, religious fanaticism, and a pattern of emotional and physical abuse that would shape Gordon's psyche in the most perverse and destructive ways possible. George Northcott, Gordon's father, was a stern, rigid, and deeply controlling man who enforced his will through physical violence and psychological terror. He was a man who subscribed to a twisted, fire and brimstone interpretation of Christianity that he used to justify his cruelty and to instill in his children a pervasive and paralyzing fear of punishment, both earthly and divine. Sarah Northcott, Gordon's mother, was a passive, frightened woman who was herself a victim of George's abuse and who lacked the emotional resources or the personal strength to protect her children from her husband's wrath. It was within this cauldron of fear, violence, and religious distortion that Gordon Stewart Northcott spent his formative years, absorbing lessons about power, control, and the use of terror to dominate others that he would later translate into a campaign of sadistic violence against innocent children. In 1914, when Gordon was 8 years old, the Northcott family relocated from Canada to the United States, eventually settling in the Los Angeles area of Southern California. The move did nothing to improve the family dynamics. If anything, the stress of starting over in a new country exacerbated the existing tensions and accelerated the deterioration of whatever fragile stability the family had possessed. As Gordon entered adolescence, he began to exhibit disturbing behavioral patterns that set him apart from his peers and alarmed those who observed him closely. He was prone to sudden, explosive fits of anger, he demonstrated a cruel streak toward animals and younger children, and he displayed an unhealthy and inappropriate interest in the bodies of boys. These warning signs, which would be recognized today as red flags for a developing predatory personality, were either ignored or explained away by the adults around him, a failure of recognition and intervention that would have catastrophic consequences. As a young adult, Gordon Northcott drifted through a series of odd jobs and failed business ventures, never able to hold steady employment or establish a stable life for himself. He was a charming and articulate man when he wanted to be, capable of projecting a facade of respectability and normalcy that concealed the darkness within. In 1926, at the age of 19, Northcott purchased a parcel of land in the unincorporated community of Wineville, located in the rural expanses of Riverside County, California, just outside the rapidly growing city of Los Angeles. Wineville at that time was a small, isolated agricultural settlement surrounded by chicken ranches, citrus groves, and open desert, a place where people kept to themselves and minded their own business. Northcott built a chicken ranch on the property, and he moved to the ranch with his parents, George and Sarah, and his nephew, a young boy named Sanford Clark, who had been sent from Canada to live with his uncle. It was on this remote, dusty, and unremarkable piece of land that Gordon Stewart Northcott would commit some of the most heinous crimes in American history. The precise timeline of Northcote's crimes is difficult to reconstruct with absolute certainty, as Northcote himself was a prolific and accomplished liar who contradicted his own confessions on multiple occasions. However, based on the evidence gathered by investigators, the testimony of witnesses, and Northcote's own partial admissions, it is clear that the period of active predation on the Wineville Chicken Ranch began in early 1928 and lasted for several months. Northcote's primary targets were young boys, typically between the ages of 9 and 15, who were lured to the ranch under various pretexts. Some were runaways or drifters who had no one looking for them, while others were children from the local area who were enticed by Northcote's promises of work, adventure, or treats. Once a boy was on the ranch, Northcote would imprison him, subjecting him to prolonged periods of sexual abuse, physical torture, and psychological terror. The horrors that took place in the chicken coop and the main house on the Wineville Ranch are almost impossible to comprehend. Northcote constructed a system of captivity and control that was chilling in its deliberateness. He used ropes, chains, and locks to restrain his victims, and he devised methods of punishment and torture that reveal the level of sadistic creativity that is profoundly disturbing. The sounds of the boys' screams, muffled by the distance from the nearest neighbor and the thick walls of the ranch buildings, were heard by no one who was willing to intervene. The first known victim whose disappearance was directly linked to Northcote was Walter Collins, a 9-year-old boy from Los Angeles who vanished on March 10, 1928. Walter's disappearance became one of the most famous missing persons cases in California history, in part because of the extraordinary and deeply troubling actions of the Los Angeles Police Department in the aftermath of his disappearance. When Walter failed to come home from school, his mother, Christine Collins, a single parent who worked as a telephone operator, immediately reported him missing to the LAPD. The police launched a search but were unable to find any trace of the boy. Months later, the LAPD announced that Walter had been found alive and well, and they arranged a highly publicized reunion between Christine and the boy they claimed was her son. When Christine saw the boy, she immediately and instinctively knew that he was not Walter. The boy was shorter, had different color eyes, and did not possess any of Walter's distinctive physical characteristics, including dental work that Christine had paid for. Christine told the police that the boy was not her son, but the LAPD, desperate for a public relations victory in a case that was generating negative media attention, pressured Christine to take the boy home, telling her that she was in a state of shock and denial and that she would eventually realize the boy was Walter. Christine, unconvinced but initially overwhelmed by the authority of the police, took the boy home for several weeks before returning to the police station with evidence proving that the boy was an imposter, a 12-year-old runaway from Illinois named Arthur Hutchins who had impersonated Walter for the attention. The LAPD, humiliated and enraged by Christine's persistence, had her committed to a psychiatric ward under a code that allowed the police to institutionalize people they deemed mentally unstable, a chilling abuse of power that was later exposed and condemned. Christine Collins spent 5 days in the psychopathic ward before being released, and she subsequently sued the LAPD, winning a landmark judgment against the department. The Walter Collins case, which was later dramatized in the film Changeling, directed by Clint Eastwood, became inextricably linked to the Northcote case when investigators eventually determined that Walter Collins had been murdered by Gordon Stewart Northcote on the Wineville Chicken Ranch. The connection between the two cases was made through the testimony of Sanford Clark, the young nephew whom Northcote had brought from Canada. Sanford, who had been subjected to abuse by his uncle since arriving at the ranch, finally found an opportunity to communicate with the outside world. In August 1928, Sanford's sister, Jessie Clark, who had not heard from her brother in months and was deeply concerned about his welfare, traveled from Canada to California and managed to visit the Wineville Ranch. When Jessie saw the condition her brother was in, emaciated, traumatized, and clearly terrified of Northcote, she took action. Jessie contacted the American consulate in Canada, which in turn contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, and on August 31, 1928, Riverside County deputies descended on the Wineville Ranch and removed Sanford Clark from Northcote's custody. Under questioning by detectives, Sanford Clark, who was 13 years old at the time, revealed the full horror of what had been happening on the ranch. He told investigators that Northcote had abducted, abused, and murdered multiple boys, and that he, Sanford, had been forced to participate in the crimes under threat of death. Sanford described the killings in graphic detail, telling of how Northcott would beat the boys, chain them in the chicken coop, and ultimately kill them, usually by bludgeoning or shooting. He also told investigators that Northcott had forced him to help dispose of the bodies by burying them in quicklime on the ranch property. Sanford's testimony was the breakthrough that investigators needed, and it transformed what might have remained a series of unconnected missing persons cases into a focused murder investigation targeting a single suspect. When deputies returned to the Wineville ranch to conduct a thorough search, armed with Sanford's information, they found evidence that confirmed his account. Digging in the areas indicated by Sanford, investigators discovered human remains, including partial skeletons, bone fragments, and traces of quicklime. The remains were in such a degraded condition, due to the effects of the quicklime and the passage of time, that definitive identification of all the victims was not possible. However, the physical evidence, combined with Sanford's testimony and the records of missing children from the Los Angeles area, was sufficient to build a case against Northcott. In addition to Walter Collins, investigators identified at least 2 other victims whose remains were linked to the ranch, the Norton brothers, Lewis and Nelson, aged 10 and 12 respectively, who had vanished from their home in Pomona, California, in May 1928. A 4th victim, an unidentified boy known only as the Headless Mexican, was also believed to have been killed by Northcott, though his identity was never definitively established. When Northcott learned that the authorities were closing in on him, he fled. He took his mother, Sarah, and escaped to Canada, but they were tracked down by Canadian authorities and arrested near Vernon, British Columbia, in September 1928. Northcott fought extradition for a time but was eventually returned to Riverside County, California, to face trial for the murders. The legal proceedings against Gordon Stewart Northcott were among the most sensational and closely watched in California history, attracting reporters from across the country and generating a level of public outrage and fascination that rivaled any murder case of the era. The trial took place in the Riverside County Superior Court, with Judge Thomas Shoemaker presiding. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Earl Redwine, presented a case that was built primarily on the testimony of Sanford Clark, whose credibility was the linchpin of the entire prosecution. Sanford, despite his young age and the trauma he had endured, testified with a clarity and specificity that was devastating to Northcott's defense. He described the abduction, abuse, and murder of Walter Collins, the Norton brothers, and the unidentified Mexican boy in meticulous detail, providing information that only someone who had been present at the crimes could have known. The prosecution also presented the physical evidence recovered from the ranch, including the human remains and the tools believed to have been used in the killings. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial occurred when Northcott himself took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was a bizarre and rambling performance in which he alternately denied the murders, confessed to them, implicated his mother and his father, and offered a series of outlandish and contradictory explanations for the evidence. At one point, he claimed that his father had committed the murders and that he had been forced to cover them up. At another point, he claimed that the boys were still alive and being held in a secret location. His erratic and clearly dishonest testimony destroyed whatever credibility he might have had with the jury and only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of him as a cunning, manipulative, and remorseless predator. Sarah Northcott was also prosecuted for her role in the crimes. She initially confessed to participating in the murder of Walter Collins, a confession she later recanted, claiming that she had been coerced by the police and by her son. She was ultimately convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to life in prison, though she served only 12 years before being paroled. George Northcott was not prosecuted, as he was deemed to be too elderly and infirm to stand trial, a decision that was controversial at the time and remains so among historians of the case. On February 13, 1929, after a trial that had lasted for weeks and had gripped the nation, the jury found Gordon Stewart Northcott guilty of the murder of Walter Collins and the Norton brothers. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The trial and the surrounding media coverage generated such an outpouring of public revulsion toward Northcott and toward the town where his crimes had taken place that the residents of Wineville took the extraordinary step of changing the town's name. In 1930, the community voted to rename itself Mira Loma, a name that means view of the hills in Spanish, in a desperate attempt to distance itself from the stigma of the Northcote murders. The name Wineville was erased from the maps, but the horror of what had happened there could not be so easily erased from the collective memory. On October 2, 1930, Gordon Stewart Northcote was hanged at San Quentin State Prison. He went to his death maintaining his innocence in some respects and offering contradictory final statements, a fittingly confused and cowardly end for a man who had caused so much suffering and confusion in life. Sanford Clark, the young nephew whose bravery in coming forward had been the key to bringing Northcote to justice, was returned to Canada after the trial. Despite the trauma he had endured, Sanford went on to live a relatively stable and productive life, serving in the Canadian military during World War II, getting married, and working at a lumber mill. He never spoke publicly about his experiences on the Wineville Ranch until late in his life, when he was interviewed by researchers and journalists who were documenting the case. Sanford's resilience in the face of the unspeakable horrors he had witnessed and been forced to participate in is one of the few rays of light in an otherwise pitch-dark story. The legacy of the Wineville Chicken Ranch murders is profound and enduring. The case exposed the vulnerability of children in an era before modern child protection systems existed, and it highlighted the dangers of isolated, unregulated environments where predators could operate without oversight. The failures of the LAPD in the Walter Collins case, particularly the institutionalization of Christine Collins for daring to challenge the police narrative, became a landmark in the history of police reform in Los Angeles, contributing to a political movement that eventually led to the removal of the corrupt police chief and the restructuring of the department. The case also left a permanent scar on the landscape of Riverside County. The Northcote Ranch was demolished, and the land was absorbed into the surrounding agricultural properties, but the memory of what happened there persisted for generations. Even after the town changed its name, locals continued to refer to the area as Wineville, and the story of the Chicken Ranch murders was passed down as a dark piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the evil that can take root in even the most innocent-looking places. For the families of the victims, particularly Christine Collins, the case was a source of lifelong pain and a sense of justice that was never fully satisfied. Christine Collins never stopped searching for her son's body, and she never received a definitive answer about the exact circumstances of his death. As Northcote's contradictory confessions made it impossible to separate fact from fiction. She spent the rest of her life haunted by the loss of Walter and by the betrayal she had suffered at the hands of the LAPD, a double victimization that epitomized the systemic failures that the Northcote case exposed. Gordon Stewart Northcote remains one of the most reviled figures in American criminal history, a man whose crimes were so grotesque and whose betrayal of the most basic norms of human decency was so complete that his name has become synonymous with the very concept of evil. The fact that he was able to carry out his crimes for months in a small, rural community, with neighbors hearing screams and seeing suspicious activity but choosing not to intervene, is a damning indictment of the culture of silence and willful ignorance that allowed such horrors to flourish. The trust that the small community of Wineville placed in the idea that their quiet, isolated corner of the world was safe from the evils of the big city was permanently and irrevocably broken by Gordon Stewart Northcote, and the name that the town was forced to abandon serves as a permanent reminder that evil is not a product of location but of the human heart, and that it can take root and grow in any soil, no matter how fertile or how barren, if it is left unchecked by the courage and vigilance of decent people. Number 6, David Parker Ray, a mechanic from a small New Mexico town who constructed a mobile torture chamber inside a soundproof trailer, committed unspeakable acts of sexual sadism against multiple women, and shattered the illusion of safety in a remote desert community where neighbors trusted one another implicitly. David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico, a small town situated along the Rio Grande in the arid landscape of the American Southwest. Ray's early life was marked by profound instability and emotional neglect, conditions that would later be cited by psychologists and criminologists as the foundational elements of his deeply disturbed psychology. His parents, Cecil and Opal Ray, separated when David was very young, and the dissolution of the marriage was followed by a chaotic custody arrangement that left the young boy shuffled between relatives and temporary caretakers. David's father, Cecil, was a man with a violent temper and a history of abusive behavior, traits that he passed on to his son both through genetic inheritance and through the brutal example of his conduct. Cecil's treatment of David was characterized by harsh physical discipline and emotional cruelty, creating an environment in which the child learned that power was expressed through domination and that love was synonymous with pain. David's relationship with his mother, Opal, was equally damaging, though in different ways. Opal was a woman who was largely absent from her son's daily life, either physically or emotionally, and her inability to provide the nurturing and stability that a young child needs left David with a deep and abiding sense of abandonment and worthlessness. This combination of paternal abuse and maternal neglect created a psychological void in David Parker Ray that he would spend his entire life trying to fill, first through escalating violent fantasies and eventually through the actual commission of horrific crimes against women. As David grew into adolescence and young adulthood, his social development was severely stunted. He was a loner who had difficulty forming meaningful relationships with his peers, and he was frequently described by those who knew him as quiet, awkward, and vaguely unsettling. He graduated from high school but showed no interest in pursuing higher education, instead drifting into a series of manual labor jobs that utilized his mechanical aptitude. Ray had an innate talent for working with his hands, a skill that he developed into a profession as a mechanic, eventually opening his own auto repair shop in the small town of Elephant Butte, New Mexico. Elephant Butte is a remote community of roughly 1,300 people, located on the edge of the Elephant Butte Reservoir in the arid desert of Sierra County. The town's economy is driven primarily by tourism related to the reservoir, which attracts boaters, fishermen, and campers from across the region. Life in Elephant Butte was quiet, slow-paced, and governed by the unspoken rules of small-town existence, where everyone knew their neighbors and where a person's reputation was their most valuable asset. It was into this environment that David Parker Ray settled in the late 1980s, establishing himself as a competent and reliable mechanic who kept to himself and caused no trouble for anyone. To the residents of Elephant Butte, Ray was the kind of unremarkable figure who blended seamlessly into the background of daily life, a man you would nod to at the post office or chat with briefly at the gas station without ever really knowing what was going on behind his eyes. What was going on behind David Parker Ray's eyes, however, was a decades-long, meticulously cultivated fantasy of sexual torture and enslavement that had begun in his adolescence and had grown more elaborate and more violent with each passing year. Ray was a sexual sadist of the most extreme and dangerous variety, a man who derived intense psychological and sexual gratification from the suffering, helplessness, and degradation of other human beings. Unlike many sexual predators who act impulsively, driven by sudden and overwhelming urges, Ray was a methodical planner who spent years designing and building the physical infrastructure necessary to carry out his fantasies in a controlled and sustained manner. This infrastructure took the form of a modified trailer that Ray kept on a secluded property he owned near Elephant Butte. Over a period of years, Ray transformed the interior of this trailer into what he called his toy box, a soundproofed, windowless chamber of horrors that was equipped with an array of devices designed specifically for the purpose of torturing and restraining human beings. The trailer was outfitted with chains, pulleys, shackles, a gynecological examination table, surgical instruments, electrical shock devices, and an extensive collection of whips, clamps, and other implements of torture. Ray installed a sophisticated soundproofing system that ensured no sounds from inside the trailer could be heard from the outside, even at close range. He also installed a generator and an elaborate system of mirrors and monitoring equipment that allowed him to observe his victims from multiple angles. The level of planning, technical skill, and financial investment that Ray poured into the construction of the toy box was staggering, and it revealed a mind that was not only sadistic but deeply organized and disciplined, capable of sustaining a long-term criminal enterprise under the noses of an entire community. Ray did not act alone. He was aided and abetted by two women who were drawn into his orbit and who became willing participants in his crimes. The first was Cindy Hendy, a woman with a troubled background and a history of abusive relationships who met Ray in the early 1990s and quickly became his girlfriend and accomplice. Hendy was a damaged and manipulative individual who, according to later testimony, was herself subjected to abuse by Ray but who chose to align herself with him and to participate in the abduction and torture of other women rather than escape or seek help. The second accomplice was Ray's daughter, Glenda Jean Ray, known as Jessie, who was deeply loyal to her father and who assisted him in various aspects of his criminal operations, including the abduction of at least one victim. The dynamic between Ray, Hendy, and Jessie Ray was a twisted and codependent triangle of shared depravity, a miniature criminal enterprise that operated with absolute secrecy and efficiency within the protective isolation of the Elephant Butte Desert. The precise number of women who fell victim to David Parker Ray may never be known. Ray himself, when he was eventually captured and interrogated, claimed to have killed as many as 40 women over a period of decades, a claim that investigators were unable to fully substantiate due to the absence of bodies and the difficulty of verifying such a large number of disappearances. However, what is known with certainty is that Ray abducted, tortured, and sexually assaulted multiple women in his trailer of horrors, and that he did so with a level of calculated brutality that is almost unmatched in the annals of American criminal history. Ray's method of operation was consistent across his known attacks. He would identify a vulnerable woman, typically someone who was marginalized in some way, a sex worker, a drug user, a transient, or someone who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He would approach the woman, sometimes alone and sometimes with Hendy or Jessie, and lure her to a location where she could be subdued, often using a ruse involving a job offer, a ride, or an invitation to socialize. Once the woman was in his control, Ray would transport her to the trailer, where she would be restrained, blindfolded, and subjected to hours or even days of sustained torture and sexual abuse. Ray recorded many of his torture sessions on audio tape, a practice that provided investigators with a horrifying and detailed record of his crimes. On these tapes, which were played during his trial, Ray can be heard addressing his victims in a calm, measured, and almost clinical voice, describing in explicit detail the tortures he is about to inflict, outlining the rules of their captivity, and explaining that they are now his property and that no one is coming to look for them. The tapes reveal a man who was not driven by rage or passion but by a cold, intellectualized sadism that was as calculated as it was depraved. He told his victims that he had been watching them for a long time, that he knew everything about them, and that he had chosen them specifically. He described the various implements he intended to use and the effects they would produce on the human body. He informed them that the trailer was soundproof and that no matter how loudly they screamed, no one would hear them. The psychological terror inflicted by these monologues was, in many ways, as devastating as the physical torture, as it stripped the victims of all hope and reduced them to a state of absolute helplessness. The turning point in the Ray case came on March 22, 1999, when a 22-year-old woman named Cynthia Vigil managed to escape from the trailer and literally ran for her life across the desert. Vigil, who had been working as a sex worker in Albuquerque, had been lured to the trailer by Cindy Hendy, who had posed as a potential client. Once inside, Vigil was overpowered by Ray and Hendy, restrained, and subjected to hours of torture. During her captivity, which lasted approximately 3 days, Vigil was repeatedly sexually assaulted, beaten, and subjected to electrical shocks. Ray told her, as he told all his victims, that she was going to die and that no one would find her body. However, on the 3rd day of her captivity, Ray left the trailer to go to his mechanic shop, leaving Cindy Hendy to guard Vigil. In a moment of extraordinary courage and quick thinking, Vigil managed to free herself from her restraints while Hendy was momentarily distracted. A violent physical struggle ensued between the two women, during which Vigil managed to grab a knife and stab Hendy in the neck. Severely wounded but still mobile, Hendy fled the trailer, and Vigil, naked, bleeding, and wearing only a padlocked metal collar that Ray had fastened around her neck, ran out into the desert. She ran until she reached a nearby mobile home, where she pounded on the door and screamed for help. The residents, shocked and horrified by the sight of the young woman, called the police. When Sierra County deputies arrived, they found Vigil in a state of extreme trauma, with the metal collar still locked around her neck. She was able to provide a description of the trailer and her captors, information that led deputies directly to David Parker Ray's property. The deputies arrived at the property and found the trailer, which was exactly as Vigil had described it. Inside, they discovered the full horror of Ray's toy box, the chains, the shackles, the torture devices, the mirrors, the soundproofing, and the extensive collection of tools and implements that Ray had accumulated over the years. They also found the audio tapes, hundreds of them, documenting hours of torture sessions with multiple victims. The sheer scale and sophistication of the operation stunned even the most experienced investigators, some of whom had worked on serial killer cases for decades. David Parker Ray was arrested on March 22, 1999, as was Cindy Hendy, who was found at a local hospital seeking treatment for the stab wound Vigil had inflicted. Glenda Jean Ray was arrested shortly thereafter. The investigation that followed the discovery of the trailer was one of the most extensive and complex in New Mexico's history. Investigators from the Sierra County Sheriff's Office, the New Mexico State Police, and the FBI worked together to process the massive amount of physical and forensic evidence recovered from the trailer and the surrounding property. They searched the desert around Ray's property for buried remains, using cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and excavation equipment. Despite these exhaustive efforts, no human remains were ever found on Ray's property, a fact that complicated the prosecution and that has led to decades of speculation about what happened to the bodies of Ray's victims. Investigators theorized that Ray disposed of the bodies in the vast and inhospitable desert surrounding Elephant Butte, where the arid terrain, scavenging animals, and the passage of time would make recovery all but impossible. They also explored the possibility that Ray had disposed of bodies in the Elephant Butte Reservoir, a large body of water that would have been an effective and difficult-to-search burial site. As the investigation progressed, other victims began to come forward, women who had survived encounters with Ray but who had never reported their experiences to the authorities, often out of shame, fear, or the belief that no one would believe them. One of these survivors was a woman named Angelica Montano, who testified that she had been abducted and tortured by Ray in 1997 but had managed to escape by jumping from his moving vehicle. Another survivor, identified only as KM in court documents, testified about a similar ordeal. The testimony of these survivors, combined with the evidence from the trailer and the audio tapes, painted a devastating picture of a predator who had been operating with impunity for years, preying on the most vulnerable women in the region and destroying their lives with calculated, systematic cruelty. The prosecution of David Parker Ray was a complex legal undertaking that was hampered by the absence of bodies and the challenge of proving specific crimes beyond a reasonable doubt when the victims had been traumatized to the point of profound psychological damage. The state of New Mexico initially charged Ray with multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, and conspiracy, related to the abductions of Cynthia Vigil, Angelica Montano, and KM. The trial took place in the Sierra County District Court, where the prosecution presented the physical evidence from the trailer, the audio tapes, and the testimony of the surviving victims. The audio tapes, in particular, were a devastating piece of evidence, as they contained Ray's own voice describing his crimes in explicit detail. The defense argued that the tapes were fantasies, not real recordings of actual crimes, and that the victims had fabricated their stories. However, the jury was not persuaded by this argument, and in September 2001, David Parker Ray was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping and sexual assault related to the abduction and torture of Cynthia Vigil and Angelica Montano. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison, a sentence that was effectively a life term, as there was no possibility of him ever being paroled. Cindy Hendy, in a plea agreement with prosecutors, pleaded guilty to kidnapping and conspiracy and was sentenced to 36 years in prison in exchange for her testimony against Ray. Glenda Jean Ray pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and received a reduced sentence. Despite his conviction in New Mexico, Ray still faced potential charges in Arizona, where investigators believed he had committed additional crimes. However, before those proceedings could move forward, David Parker Ray died on May 28, 2002, at the age of 62, while in the custody of the New Mexico Department of Corrections. The official cause of death was a heart attack, though there were reports that he may have been experiencing symptoms of a myocardial infarction for some time before his death. His death brought a definitive end to the criminal proceedings against him but did nothing to resolve the larger mystery surrounding his case, most critically the question of how many women he actually killed and where their remains were located. The impact of the David Parker Ray case on the community of Elephant Butte and the surrounding region was profound and devastating. Elephant Butte was a town where trust was not just a social nicety but a practical necessity, a community where people relied on one another for help, companionship, and survival in a harsh desert environment. The revelation that a respected local mechanic had been operating a torture chamber in a trailer just a few miles from town was a body blow to that trust, a revelation that forced every resident to look at their neighbors, their co-workers, and their community with a new and deeply unsettling set of eyes. How could this have happened here, people asked, and the answer, as it always is in cases like this, was that it happened because the perpetrator was expert at concealing his true nature, because the victims were marginalized and their disappearances went unnoted, and because the community's trust in its own safety created a blind spot that a predator like Ray could exploit with devastating efficiency. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of sex workers and other marginalized women to predatory violence. Ray's known victims were women who existed on the fringes of society, women whose disappearances were not always treated with the same urgency by law enforcement as the disappearances of middle-class women with strong social ties. The fact that Ray was able to prey on these women for years without being caught was a grim indictment of a system that devalues the lives of certain individuals and fails to allocate adequate resources to investigating their victimization. In the years since Ray's death, the Elephant Butte community has worked to move past the trauma of the case, but the scar remains. The property where the trailer was located has been cleared and redeveloped, and the trailer itself was destroyed by the authorities after the investigation was completed. But the memory of what was found inside that trailer lingers in the desert air like a toxic residue, a permanent reminder that the most horrifying evil can flourish in the most ordinary and unassuming of settings. David Parker Ray was not a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man, a quiet, unremarkable man who fixed cars and paid his bills and nodded to his neighbors, and who also, in the privacy of his soundproof trailer, inflicted suffering on other human beings that defies comprehension. The trust that the Elephant Butte community placed in the normalcy of their daily lives, in the assumption that the people around them were essentially good and that their small town was immune to the horrors of the wider world, was permanently and irrevocably broken by David Parker Ray, and the lessons of his case, about the nature of predatory evil, the vulnerability of the marginalized, and the fragility of trust in small communities, remain as relevant and as urgent today as they were on the day Cynthia Vigil ran naked and bleeding across the desert, a collar locked around her neck, screaming for the help that almost came too late. Number 7, Clayton Wagner, an anti-government extremist who exploited the chaos and fear following the September 11 attacks to launch a nationwide anthrax hoax terror campaign against women's health clinics, shattering the trust of small communities across the Midwest where he hid in plain sight while mailing hundreds of letters containing white powder. Clayton Lee Wagner was born in 1955 and grew up in the Midwest, spending a significant portion of his life in the state of Illinois and moving through a series of communities that would later serve as the backdrop for his crimes. Unlike many criminals who exhibit violent tendencies from a young age, Wagner's early adult life was characterized by a surface-level appearance of normalcy. He married and fathered children, working in various blue-collar capacities to support his family. However, beneath this veneer of suburban respectability, Wagner harbored a deep-seated resentment toward authority and a growing fascination with anti-government and anti-abortion extremism that would eventually consume his entire existence and transform him into one of the most prolific domestic terrorists in American history. Wagner's criminal trajectory began long before his infamous anthrax hoax campaign, with a series of increasingly serious offenses that demonstrated both his capacity for violence and his willingness to flout the laws of society. In 1992, Wagner was convicted in Illinois on theft and burglary charges, crimes that were relatively minor in the scheme of his eventual infamy but which provided the first official record of his disregard for the law. He served time in state custody, an experience that did not rehabilitate him but rather seemed to harden his anti-government ideology and deepen his sense of grievance against a system he viewed as fundamentally corrupt and illegitimate. Following his release from state custody, Wagner's behavior escalated dramatically. In 1997, he was arrested in North Carolina for a string of armed robberies, crimes that were far more serious than his previous offenses and that demonstrated a growing willingness to use weapons and intimidation to achieve his goals. It was during this period that Wagner's ideological leanings began to crystallize into a coherent, if deeply distorted, worldview that fused religious fundamentalism, anti-government paranoia, and a fanatical opposition to abortion. Wagner came to view himself as a soldier in a holy war against what he perceived as the moral decay of American society, with abortion providers serving as the primary targets of his righteous wrath. In 1999, Wagner was convicted in federal court on firearms charges related to the North Carolina robberies, and he was sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison. For most people, a federal prison sentence would be a catastrophic event that forces a profound reckoning with the consequences of one's actions, but for Clayton Wagner, it was merely an inconvenience, a temporary setback in his self-appointed mission. Wagner was housed at a federal correctional facility in Illinois, and it was from this facility that he engineered one of the most audacious and alarming prison escapes in recent American history. On September 19, 2001, just 8 days after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Wagner walked out of the federal prison in Milan, Michigan. The escape was astonishing in its simplicity and its timing. Wagner, who had been transferred to the Milan facility from Illinois, simply walked away from a minimum security work detail, vanishing into the surrounding countryside without a single shot being fired or a single alarm being triggered. The timing of the escape, coming as it did while the entire nation was reeling from the September 11 attacks and the subsequent anthrax mailings that were targeting major media outlets and congressional offices, was not a coincidence. Wagner understood, with the instinct of a predator who senses opportunity in chaos, that the nation's law enforcement and security apparatus was focused almost entirely on the threat of international terrorism, leaving a significant vacuum in the resources dedicated to tracking domestic fugitives. He also understood that the fear generated by the actual anthrax mailings created a psychological environment in which a hoax campaign could inflict massive disruption and terror with relatively little effort or risk. After his escape from Milan, Wagner embarked on a cross-country odyssey that took him through multiple states and through numerous small communities where he relied on the inherent trust of strangers to evade capture. He stole vehicles, including a tow truck and a recreational vehicle, and he burglarized homes and businesses to obtain money, supplies, and weapons. He moved through rural areas and small towns, places where an unfamiliar face might attract a glance but rarely a thorough investigation, exploiting the openness and trust that characterize life in less populated areas. During this period on the run, Wagner began to formulate the plan for his anthrax hoax campaign, a plan that was designed to maximize fear and disruption while minimizing the risk of detection and physical harm to himself. The target of Wagner's campaign was the network of women's health clinics across the United States that provided abortion services, organizations that had been the focus of intense harassment, violence, and domestic terrorism for decades. Wagner, who had previously been identified by the authorities as a potential threat to abortion providers, saw the post-September 11 environment as the perfect moment to strike a devastating blow against these clinics. Beginning in October 2001 and continuing through the end of the year, Wagner mailed more than 500 letters to women's health clinics in at least 16 states. The letters were contained in standard envelopes and were accompanied by a return address that was often fabricated to suggest they came from a legitimate government agency or a known anti-abortion organization. Inside each envelope was a white powder that Wagner claimed was anthrax, but that was, in reality, a harmless substance, typically baking soda or a similar white powder. The letters contained threatening messages, some of which claimed that the recipient had been exposed to anthrax and that they were going to die, while others contained more general threats against the clinic and its staff. The impact of these letters was immediate and catastrophic for the clinics that received them. In the context of the actual anthrax mailings that were occurring at the same time, every letter containing white powder was treated as a credible threat of biological terrorism. Clinics were evacuated, locked down, and closed for decontamination procedures that often lasted days. Hazardous materials teams in full biohazard suits descended on the clinics, conducting extensive testing and cleanup operations. Employees who had come into contact with the letters were placed on preventive antibiotics and subjected to stressful and invasive medical monitoring. The financial cost of the response was enormous, running into the millions of dollars, and the psychological cost to the clinic staff, who were already working under the constant threat of violence, was incalculable. Many clinics were forced to close temporarily, disrupting access to healthcare for thousands of women who relied on these facilities for a range of medical services, not just abortions. The terror campaign was, by any measure, a spectacular success from the perspective of the terrorist, achieving massive disruption and fear with minimal resources and no actual biological agent. What made Wagner's campaign particularly insidious was the way it exploited the trust and interconnectedness of the small communities where many of these clinics were located. Women's health clinics in rural and small-town America are often embedded in the fabric of their communities, sharing buildings with other medical providers, located in residential neighborhoods, and staffed by people who are well-known and well-liked in the area. When a hoax anthrax letter arrived at one of these clinics, it did not just terrorize the clinic staff, it terrorized the entire surrounding community. Neighbors were evacuated, local emergency services were overwhelmed, and the sense of safety that residents had taken for granted was shattered. The fact that the letters were hoaxes did not diminish the terror they caused. In fact, in some ways, the hoax nature of the campaign made it more insidious, as it meant that Wagner could cast a wider net, targeting more clinics with less risk of being caught in the act of mailing a genuine biological weapon. Wagner's ability to carry out this campaign while on the run from federal authorities was a testament to his cunning, his resourcefulness, and his exploitation of the vulnerabilities of small-town trust. He moved through communities, stealing what he needed, hiding in plain sight, and mailing his deadly threats from post offices in towns where no one knew who he was and where a solitary man mailing a stack of letters did not arouse suspicion. He was, in essence, using the fabric of small-town America as a camouflage suit, disappearing into the background noise of daily life while waging a campaign of terror that reached from coast to coast. The investigation into the anthrax hoax letters was one of the largest and most complex in the history of the United States Postal Inspection Service, which took the lead in the case due to the use of the mails to commit the crimes. The Postal Inspection Service worked in conjunction with the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and numerous state and local law enforcement agencies to track the origin of the letters and identify the sender. The investigation was complicated by the sheer volume of letters, the geographic spread of the targets, and the fact that the actual anthrax mailings being investigated simultaneously by the FBI diverted critical forensic resources away from the hoax investigation. Despite these challenges, investigators were able to develop several critical leads. They analyzed the letters for forensic evidence, including fingerprints, DNA, and handwriting characteristics. They traced the postmarks on the envelopes to identify the areas where the letters had been mailed from. And they developed a behavioral profile of the sender, concluding that the perpetrator was likely an anti-abortion extremist with a criminal background who was currently a fugitive from justice. This profile pointed directly to Clayton Wagner, who had been identified by the FBI prior to his escape as one of the most dangerous domestic terrorists in the country and who had posted messages on anti-abortion websites claiming that he was planning to attack abortion providers. The crucial break in the case came in December 2001, when Wagner was spotted by an alert citizen in a small community, a moment of collective vigilance that pierced the veil of anonymity he had been using to move through the country. On December 5, 2001, Wagner was arrested without incident at a copy shop in Springdale, Ohio, a suburb of Cincinnati. At the time of his arrest, he was in possession of weapons, stolen identification, and materials that were directly linked to the anthrax hoax campaign, including addresses of women's health clinics and supplies of white powder. His capture brought an immediate end to the terror campaign and triggered a massive investigation that would eventually link him to every single one of the more than 500 hoax letters. Following his arrest, Wagner was transported to federal custody, where he was interrogated by a team of investigators from the Postal Inspection Service and the FBI. Wagner, who had maintained a defiant and unrepentant posture throughout his time on the run, initially refused to cooperate with the investigation. However, as the weight of the evidence against him became clear, and as the reality of his situation sank in, Wagner began to make statements that confirmed his involvement in the hoax campaign. He told investigators that he had mailed the letters and that he considered them to be a legitimate act of war against abortion providers. He expressed no remorse for the fear and disruption he had caused and stated that he would do it again if given the opportunity. His statements were consistent with the ideology he had developed over the years, an ideology that framed violence and terror not as crimes but as moral imperatives. The legal proceedings against Clayton Wagner were extensive and resulted in convictions in multiple jurisdictions. The most significant of these proceedings took place in federal court in Philadelphia, where Wagner was tried on charges stemming from the anthrax hoax campaign. The trial, which began in 2003, was a meticulously orchestrated presentation of evidence that left no doubt about Wagner's guilt. The prosecution presented hundreds of the hoax letters, along with forensic evidence linking Wagner to the letters, including fingerprints found on some of the envelopes and DNA evidence recovered from others. They presented testimony from clinic workers who described the terror and disruption caused by the letters, as well as testimony from hazardous materials responders and postal inspectors who had been involved in the investigation. The prosecution also presented evidence of Wagner's escape from federal custody, his flight across the country, and the weapons and stolen property he had accumulated during his time on the run. The defense, such as it was, did not seriously contest Wagner's involvement in the hoax campaign. Instead, they focused on procedural issues and attempted to mitigate the severity of the sentence by highlighting Wagner's personal history and the ideological fervor that had driven his actions. However, the evidence was so overwhelming and the nature of the crime so egregious that the defense's efforts were largely futile. On January 7, 2003, the jury found Clayton Wagner guilty on all counts, including charges of threatening the use of a weapon of mass destruction, mailing threatening communications, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. The trial judge, citing the extraordinary scale and impact of Wagner's terror campaign, sentenced him to 54 years in federal prison, a sentence that ensured he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. In addition to the federal sentence, Wagner also faced state charges in Illinois related to his earlier crimes and his prison escape, resulting in additional prison time that was served concurrently with his federal sentence. Wagner was ultimately designated as a domestic terrorist by the Bureau of Prisons and was housed in a highly secure federal facility, where he was subjected to the most restrictive conditions of confinement available within the federal system. The aftermath of the Wagner case had significant and far-reaching implications for the women's health clinic community and for the broader landscape of domestic terrorism in the United States. For the clinics that had been targeted, the hoax letters were not an isolated incident but rather the most dramatic escalation in a decades-long pattern of harassment, violence, and terrorism that had claimed the lives of multiple abortion providers and support staff. The Wagner case forced a national conversation about the inadequacy of the legal protections available to clinics and their staff, and it led to significant increases in security funding and federal law enforcement attention directed at the anti-abortion extremist movement. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of the United States postal system to exploitation by domestic terrorists, a vulnerability that was simultaneously being exposed by the actual anthrax mailings and that led to significant changes in mail handling and screening procedures across the country. For the small communities where Wagner had hidden and where he had mailed his letters, the case was a sobering reminder that the threat of terrorism was not limited to distant cities or foreign enemies. Wagner had moved through their towns, slept in their vicinity, used their post offices, and exploited their trust, all while planning and executing a campaign of terror that reached across the nation. The fact that he was able to do this without being detected for months was a stark illustration of the fact that domestic terrorists do not always operate in the shadows of major metropolitan areas. Sometimes they are hiding in plain sight in the smallest and most trusting of communities, using the openness and goodwill of their neighbors as a shield against detection. Clayton Wagner remains incarcerated in the federal prison system, serving his 54-year sentence with no possibility of parole. The clinics that were targeted by his campaign have, for the most part, recovered and continue to provide healthcare services to women, though the scars of the hoax campaign, both physical and psychological, remain. The communities that Wagner passed through have returned to their normal rhythms, their residents perhaps a little less trusting, a little more vigilant, and a little more aware that the most dangerous enemies of public safety are not always the ones who announce themselves with explosions and hijackings but sometimes the ones who slip quietly through town, drop a letter in the mailbox, and drive away, leaving behind a wake of fear and disruption that takes years to fully dissipate. The case of Clayton Wagner stands as a defining example of the intersection of ideological extremism, opportunistic criminality, and the exploitation of small-town trust, a reminder that the war on terror is not just fought on foreign battlefields but in the post offices, clinics, and quiet neighborhoods of rural America, where a single envelope of white powder can destroy the sense of safety that a community has built over generations. Number 8. Christopher Ponce, a man who killed a young woman in a drunk driving crash in a small Florida community and then vanished for 25 years, living under a stolen identity in another small town where he married, raised a family, and was regarded as a quiet, dependable neighbor, perpetrating a fraud that devastated two communities and permanently broke the trust of everyone who believed they knew him. Christopher Ponce was born in the late 1960s and grew up in the Florida Keys, a chain of islands connected by bridges and highways that stretch out into the turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The Keys are a unique environment, a place where the boundaries between small-town intimacy and tourist-driven transience are constantly blurred, and where the laid-back, sun-soaked atmosphere can sometimes mask the darker currents of human behavior. Ponce was a product of this environment, a young man who moved through the social landscape of the Keys with the easy charm and lack of deep roots that characterized many of the area's younger residents. He was not a particularly remarkable figure in his youth, known to friends and acquaintances as a fun-loving, if sometimes irresponsible, young man who liked to party, drive fast cars, and enjoy the hedonistic pleasures that the Keys had to offer. He held a series of unremarkable jobs and moved through a series of unremarkable relationships, leaving behind no significant achievements or deep impressions on the people who crossed his path. On the night of June 12, 1987, Christopher Ponce's irresponsibility crossed the line from a personal flaw into a catastrophic act of violence that would end one life and irrevocably alter the course of many others. Ponce had been drinking at a bar in the Upper Keys, consuming alcohol over the course of several hours in a manner that was, unfortunately, not uncommon in the island's social scene. When he left the bar, he got behind the wheel of his car and began driving north on the Overseas Highway, the narrow, two-lane road that connects the Keys to the Florida mainland. His blood alcohol concentration was later estimated to be significantly above the legal limit, a fact that transformed his decision to drive from a reckless personal choice into a criminal act with lethal consequences. As Ponce drove north, his vehicle crossed the center line of the highway and collided head-on with a small car being driven by a young woman named Lisa Delaney. Lisa Delaney was a vibrant and beloved member of the Key West community, a young woman in her early 20s who was known for her bright smile, her generous spirit, and her promising future. The collision was catastrophic, inflicting massive trauma on both vehicles and on the human bodies inside them. Lisa Delaney was pronounced dead at the scene, her life extinguished in an instant by the reckless and selfish decision of a drunk driver. Ponce, who was also seriously injured in the crash, was extracted from his vehicle by emergency responders and transported to a local hospital for treatment. The aftermath of the crash was a nightmare of grief, anger, and bureaucratic frustration for Lisa Delaney's family. They lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend in the most sudden and violent way possible, and they were forced to navigate the criminal justice system in the midst of their devastation. The Monroe County State Attorney's Office filed charges against Christopher Ponce for DUI manslaughter, a serious felony that carried a potential prison sentence of up to 15 years. Ponce was treated for his injuries at the hospital and was released into the custody of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, where he was processed on the charges and released on bail while awaiting trial. It was during this pre-trial period that Christopher Ponce made a decision that compounded the horror of his original crime exponentially. Instead of facing the consequences of his actions, instead of standing trial and accepting whatever punishment the court deemed appropriate for the killing of Lisa Delaney, Ponce chose to run. In late 1987, while free on bail and awaiting trial, Christopher Ponce vanished. He walked away from his life in the Keys, leaving behind his family, his friends, his obligations to the court, and the grieving family of the young woman he had killed. He simply disappeared, becoming a ghost, a name on a fugitive list, a warrant in a database that would gather dust for decades. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement conducted an immediate search for Ponce, but their efforts were unsuccessful. Ponce had no significant financial resources, no known contacts out of state, and no obvious plan for disappearing, which made his ability to evade capture all the more frustrating for investigators. He seemed to have fallen off the face of the earth, a feat that, in the pre-internet, pre-digital surveillance era of 1987, was significantly easier to accomplish than it would be today. For Lisa Delaney's family, Ponce's disappearance was a second tragedy, a cruel and gratuitous addition to the pain of losing Lisa. Not only had their daughter been taken from them, but the man responsible for her death had escaped justice, denying them the closure of a conviction and a sentence. The knowledge that Ponce was out there somewhere, living his life, free and unaccountable, was a source of torment that gnawed at the family for 25 years. Every anniversary of Lisa's death, every court date that came and went without Ponce's presence, every news story about a fugitive capture that turned out not to be him, was a fresh wound. The community of Key West, which had rallied around the Delaney family in the immediate aftermath of the crash, shared in their frustration and anger, and the case became a lingering sore spot in the collective memory of the island, a reminder that the justice system, for all its power and authority, could be thwarted by a single act of cowardice. For 25 years, Christopher Ponce remained a fugitive, a ghost who haunted the margins of the Delaney family's life but who left no trace in the systems that track and locate people. The investigation into his whereabouts was never officially closed, but it gradually became a cold case, one of thousands of unsolved fugitive matters that languished in the files of law enforcement agencies across the country. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office periodically reviewed the case, checking databases, following up on leads, and distributing updated bulletins, but each review ended in the same dead end. Ponce had simply ceased to exist, as far as the systems of the state were concerned. What the authorities did not know, what no one could have known, was that Christopher Ponce had not fled to a remote jungle or a foreign country with no extradition treaty. He had not assumed the identity of a dead person or undergone plastic surgery to alter his appearance. He had, instead, done something far more audacious and far more revealing about the nature of trust in small communities. He had stolen the identity of a living person, a man named Paul, and he had used that stolen identity to create an entirely new life for himself in another small town, this one in Florida, just a few hundred miles from the scene of his crime. The details of how Ponce obtained the stolen identity are complex and involve the exploitation of gaps in the pre-digital systems of identification and record-keeping that existed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In an era before the widespread use of Social Security number verification, digital fingerprint databases, and interconnected state identification systems, it was possible for a determined and clever individual to assume another person's identity with relatively little difficulty, especially if the person whose identity was being stolen was not actively monitoring their credit or their personal information. Ponce obtained a driver's license and a Social Security card in the name of Paul, and he used these documents to build a new life that was, in every external respect, perfectly normal and entirely unremarkable. Under the name Paul, Christopher Ponce settled in the small community of Palm Bay, Florida, a city on the state's central Atlantic coast that was, at the time, experiencing rapid growth but still retained much of the small-town feel that characterized coastal Florida before the condominium boom. Ponce got a job, paid his taxes, opened bank accounts, and established a credit history, all in the name of Paul. He was, to all outward appearances, a solid, dependable, and law-abiding member of the community. He made friends, joined local organizations, and became a familiar and trusted figure in his neighborhood. Most remarkably of all, Christopher Ponce, living as Paul, got married and raised a family. He married a woman who had no idea who he really was, no idea that the man she had pledged her life to was a fugitive from justice who had killed a young woman in a drunk driving crash and then fled rather than face the consequences. Together, they had children who grew up knowing their father as Paul, a quiet, hard-working man who coached their sports teams, attended their school events, and provided for their needs. The depth and breadth of the deception are staggering to contemplate. For 25 years, Christopher Ponce lived a lie that encompassed every aspect of his existence, a lie that required constant, daily maintenance and that involved the systematic betrayal of every person who came into contact with him. His wife, who had trusted him with her life and the lives of their children, was the primary victim of this deception, though she was joined by his friends, his neighbors, his co-workers, and the entire Palm Bay community, all of whom had placed their trust in a man who did not exist. The magnitude of the fraud is not just a matter of the length of time it was sustained but of the intimacy of the relationships it corrupted. Ponce did not hide in a cabin in the woods, he embedded himself in the most personal and trusting aspects of human community, marriage, parenthood, and neighborhood life, and he used those institutions as a shield against detection. The unraveling of Christopher Ponce's quarter-century deception began, as so many fugitive cases do, with a stroke of luck and the relentless persistence of law enforcement. In 2012, 25 years after Ponce's disappearance, a task force within the United States Marshals Service that was dedicated to tracking down long-term fugitives took a fresh look at the Ponce case. The Marshals, working in conjunction with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, began re-examining the available evidence and exploring new investigative avenues that had not been available in 1987, including advanced database searches and facial recognition technology. The break came when investigators identified a potential match between Christopher Ponce and a man living in Palm Bay under the name Paul. The match was based on a combination of factors, including physical resemblance, demographic similarities, and inconsistencies in the background information associated with the Paul identity. Investigators conducted a discreet surveillance operation, monitoring the man they believed to be Ponce and gathering evidence that would confirm his identity. They obtained fingerprints from a location where the man had touched a surface, and they submitted those fingerprints to the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, the national database maintained by the FBI. The fingerprints matched the prints that had been taken from Christopher Ponce at the time of his arrest for the DUI manslaughter of Lisa Delaney in 1987. The match was conclusive and irrefutable. On October 4, 2012, United States Marshals and local law enforcement officers converged on the Palm Bay residence of the man known as Paul. When they knocked on the door, Christopher Ponce answered, and when they identified themselves and told him why they were there, the 25-year lie collapsed in an instant. Ponce was arrested without incident and taken into custody. The arrest was a moment of profound shock and devastation for the family he had built under the stolen identity. His wife, who had been married to him for years and who had borne his children, learned in the space of a single conversation that her husband was not who he claimed to be, that his name was not Paul, that he was a fugitive, and that he had killed a young woman in a drunk driving crash a quarter of a century earlier. The emotional devastation inflicted on this woman and her children was immense and immediate, a betrayal so total and so fundamental that it called into question every memory, every experience, and every assumption upon which their family life had been built. The children, who had grown up knowing their father as a loving and dependable presence, were forced to reconcile the man they loved with the criminal who had been paraded before them in handcuffs. The community of Palm Bay, where the man known as Paul had been a trusted neighbor and friend, was equally shocked and felt equally betrayed. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood and the city, and the reaction was one of disbelief, followed by anger, followed by a deep and unsettling sense of vulnerability. If this man, this quiet, dependable, seemingly normal man, could live a lie for 25 years in their community, deceiving everyone around him, then who else might be doing the same thing? The trust that the residents of Palm Bay had placed in their neighbors, in the basic assumption that the people around them were who they said they were, was shattered. The legal proceedings against Christopher Ponce following his capture were focused on the original charge of DUI manslaughter, as the statute of limitations on that charge had been told, or paused, during the period of his flight from justice. Ponce was extradited from Palm Bay to Monroe County, where he was formally charged with the 1987 killing of Lisa Delaney. He ultimately pleaded guilty to the charge, a plea that was driven by the overwhelming evidence against him and the impossibility of mounting a credible defense after his identity had been irrefutably established. During the sentencing hearing, Ponce offered an apology to the Delaney family, a statement that was met with skepticism and anger by a family that had waited 25 years to hear those words and that viewed them as a self-serving attempt to mitigate his sentence rather than a genuine expression of remorse. The judge, recognizing the egregious nature of both the original crime and the quarter-century flight from justice, sentenced Ponce to the maximum allowable term under the law, which was 15 years in state prison. For the Delaney family, the sentence, while welcome, was inadequate to the scale of the suffering they had endured. 25 years of waiting, wondering, and grieving could not be undone by a prison sentence, no matter how long. The case of Christopher Ponce is a deeply disturbing exploration of the fragility of trust in small communities and the extraordinary lengths to which a criminal will go to avoid accountability. Ponce's crime was not a premeditated murder or an act of terrorism, it was a drunk driving crash, a crime that is horrifyingly common and that destroys families every day. What elevated the Ponce case to the level of true crime infamy was not the nature of the original offense but the nature of the cover-up, the 25-year lie that required the systematic and merciless betrayal of every person who came into contact with Ponce during his quarter-century on the run. He did not hide in isolation, he hid in plain sight, using the most intimate and trusting institutions of human society, marriage and family, as a disguise. The trust that the communities of Palm Bay and the Florida Keys placed in the basic honesty of the people around them was permanently broken by Christopher Ponce, not because he was a master criminal or a criminal genius, but because he was willing to exploit that trust to an extent that most decent people cannot even imagine. His case is a reminder that the most damaging lies are not the ones told to strangers but the ones told to the people who are closest to us, the people who love us and trust us the most, and that the consequences of those lies, when they are finally exposed, can be as devastating as any act of physical violence. Number 9, John Esposito, a man who constructed a secret underground bunker beneath his home in a quiet Long Island community and used it to imprison a 10-year-old girl for over 2 weeks, committing an act of predatory deception that shattered the fundamental sense of safety in a neighborhood where parents had trusted their neighbors to watch over their children. John Joseph Esposito was born on May 3, 1945, in the New York City borough of Brooklyn, and he spent his early life in the urban environment of the city before eventually moving to the suburban communities of Long Island. Esposito's background was, in many respects, utterly ordinary, characterized by the kind of unremarkable details that describe millions of American men of his generation. He served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War era, an experience that he later referenced in conversations with neighbors and acquaintances, using his military service as a shorthand for respectability and trustworthiness. After his discharge from the Navy, Esposito worked a series of blue-collar jobs, including a long period of employment as a mechanic and a maintenance worker, trades that utilized his practical skills and provided him with a steady, if modest, income. He was not a wealthy man, nor was he a particularly ambitious one, content to live a quiet life below the radar of those around him. In the 1980s, Esposito purchased a home in the community of Hampton Bays, New York, a small, unincorporated hamlet located on the south shore of Long Island. Hampton Bays is part of the Greater Hamptons region, a name that conjures images of extreme wealth, celebrity mansions, and glamorous social events, but the reality of Hampton Bays itself was, and remains, far more prosaic. It is a working-class and middle-class community of modest homes, local businesses, and quiet streets, a place where families raise children, tend their lawns, and live their lives far removed from the glittering excesses of the East Hamptons. The streets of Hampton Bays are the kind of places where children ride their bicycles, where neighbors chat across fences, and where the default assumption is that the people living around you are essentially decent and pose no threat to your family. It was precisely this assumption of safety and normalcy that John Esposito would exploit with devastating effectiveness. To the residents of his Hampton Bays neighborhood, Esposito was a familiar but not particularly prominent figure. He was a single man who lived alone, which was somewhat unusual in a neighborhood dominated by families, but not so unusual as to generate suspicion or concern. He kept his property reasonably well maintained, waved to his neighbors, and engaged in the kind of superficially pleasant interactions that constitute the social glue of suburban life. He was known as a quiet man, somewhat aloof and private, but not unfriendly. No one in the neighborhood had any reason to view John Esposito as anything other than what he appeared to be, a middle-aged bachelor living a quiet life in a quiet community. Beneath this carefully maintained exterior of normalcy, however, John Esposito was harboring a dark and predatory obsession that had been developing within him for years. Esposito was a pedophile, a man who was sexually attracted to children, and specifically to young girls, and he had been entertaining elaborate fantasies of abducting and imprisoning a child for an extended period. These were not idle or fleeting thoughts, they were deeply rooted, persistent, and meticulously elaborated fantasies that Esposito had been cultivating and refining for a considerable period of time. What distinguished Esposito from many individuals who harbor similar disturbing fantasies was his willingness and ability to translate those fantasies into physical reality. Over a period of years, Esposito undertook a secret construction project beneath his Hampton Bays home that was as ambitious as it was horrifying. Working alone and in complete secrecy, Esposito excavated a large chamber beneath the concrete floor of his basement, creating a space that was roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet high. The excavation was a massive undertaking that required the removal of tons of soil and rock, all of which Esposito had to dispose of without attracting the attention of his neighbors or the local authorities. He accomplished this by gradually removing small amounts of soil at a time, hiding it in his trash, burying it on his property, and transporting it away in his vehicle under the cover of darkness. The process took months, possibly years, and it demonstrated a level of patience, planning, and physical effort that was as disturbing as it was impressive. Once the excavation was complete, Esposito reinforced the chamber with concrete and steel, creating a structure that was virtually indestructible from the inside. He installed a heavy steel door that could only be opened from the outside, effectively making the chamber a locked vault from which there was no possibility of escape. He ran electricity into the bunker, providing lighting and power for a small space heater. He furnished the space with a mattress, blankets, a bucket for use as a toilet, and a supply of food and water. He also installed a ventilation system that allowed air to circulate, preventing the occupant from suffocating. The chamber that Esposito constructed was not a makeshift or improvised space, it was a purpose-built prison, designed with the specific intention of holding a human being captive for an extended period in conditions of total isolation and helplessness. The fact that Esposito was able to construct this bunker beneath his home without anyone noticing is a testament to both his cunning and the inherent trust that his neighbors placed in the normalcy of their suburban environment. The construction of an underground bunker is a noisy, messy, and labor-intensive process, but Esposito managed to conceal it by timing his work to coincide with periods when his neighbors were away, by keeping his windows and doors closed, and by maintaining the outward appearance of his home and property. The trust that his neighbors placed in him, the assumption that a single man working in his basement was engaged in some harmless home improvement project, was the very shield behind which he hid his monstrous preparations. On December 21, 1996, John Esposito put his plan into action. His target was a 10-year-old girl named Katie Beers, who lived in the same Hampton Bays neighborhood. Katie was a child who was known to be somewhat vulnerable, as she came from a troubled home environment. She was being raised by a family friend and legal guardian, Marilyn Beers, after being removed from the custody of her biological mother due to issues of neglect. While Marilyn Beers provided a stable home for Katie, the child's history of instability and her need for adult attention and affection made her a target for a predator like Esposito, who had been watching her and cultivating a relationship with her for some time. Esposito had ingratiated himself with Katie by offering her small gifts, treats, and the kind of attentive, friendly adult interaction that a child in her situation craved. He had established himself in Katie's mind as a safe and trustworthy adult, a neighbor who was kind to her and who she had no reason to fear. On the day of the abduction, Esposito encountered Katie in the neighborhood and lured her into his home with the promise of a gift, a Nintendo video game system that he knew she wanted. Once Katie was inside the house, Esposito overpowered her, forced her down into the basement, and through the steel door of the hidden bunker. He locked the door behind her, sealing her in the underground chamber that he had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Katie Beers was now a prisoner in a concrete vault beneath the home of a man her family and her community trusted. For the next 17 days, Katie Beers was held captive in Esposito's bunker, enduring an ordeal that no child should ever have to experience. The conditions in the bunker were stark and terrifying, especially for a 10-year-old child. The space was windowless, soundproofed, and completely devoid of natural light. The only illumination came from a bare light bulb that Esposito controlled, and when the light was off, the bunker was plunged into an absolute and suffocating darkness that must have been profoundly disorienting and frightening for a child. The temperature in the bunker was cold and damp, despite the space heater, and the only furniture was the mattress on which Katie slept. Esposito visited the bunker periodically to bring food, water, and clean bedding, and during these visits, he subjected Katie to sexual abuse. The psychological terror of the situation was, in many ways, more devastating than the physical conditions. Katie had no idea where she was, no idea if anyone was looking for her, and no idea if she would ever be released. She was completely at the mercy of her captor, a man who had demonstrated through his actions that he was capable of the most extreme form of predatory violence. Esposito reinforced this sense of helplessness by telling Katie that no one was looking for her, that no one cared about her, and that she would never be found. These psychological manipulations were designed to break her spirit and to ensure her compliance, and they were inflicted on a child who had already experienced more instability and trauma in her young life than most adults endure in a lifetime. While Katie was imprisoned in the bunker, the world above ground was in a state of frantic and desperate activity. When Katie failed to come home on the evening of December 21st, Marilyn Beers immediately contacted the Suffolk County Police Department and reported the child missing. Given Katie's age and the circumstances of her disappearance, the police launched an immediate and massive search effort. The response was one of the largest in Suffolk County history, involving hundreds of police officers, detectives, volunteers, and K-9 units. The neighborhood was canvassed door to door, wooded areas were searched, ponds and waterways were dragged, and a command post was established to coordinate the effort. The media descended on Hampton Bays, and Katie's face was broadcast on every television station in the New York metropolitan area. The community was galvanized by the case, with volunteers turning out in large numbers to assist in the search and with local businesses posting flyers and offering rewards for information. The intensity of the search was a reflection of the community's collective outrage and fear, a recognition that a child had been taken from their midst and that every resource available must be deployed to find her. John Esposito, remarkably, was present in the neighborhood during the search, and he even participated in it, joining the volunteers who were combing the area for any sign of the missing girl. This act of breathtaking audacity and deception was entirely consistent with Esposito's character. By inserting himself into the search effort, he was able to monitor the progress of the investigation, identify potential threats to his secret, and reinforce his public image as a concerned and helpful neighbor. It was a performance of extraordinary cynicism, a man helping to search for a child he had hidden beneath his own floor, and it was successful precisely because of the trust that his neighbors had placed in him. No one suspected the quiet, helpful bachelor who lived alone down the street. The investigation into Katie's disappearance was exhaustive and methodical, and it eventually focused on the people in Katie's immediate circle, including the neighbors who knew her. Detectives conducted interviews with everyone who had had any contact with Katie in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance, and Esposito was among those interviewed. During the interview, Esposito was calm and cooperative, providing answers to the detectives' questions that were consistent with his cover story. He denied any knowledge of Katie's whereabouts and expressed concern for her safety, a performance that was convincing enough to avoid immediate suspicion. However, the detectives noted some minor inconsistencies in Esposito's account, inconsistencies that were not sufficient to justify an arrest but that were sufficient to keep him on the radar of the investigation. The breakthrough in the case came from a source that no one could have predicted. While Katie was still being held captive in the bunker, Esposito, in a moment of uncharacteristic carelessness or perhaps a subconscious desire to be caught, made a series of phone calls to a friend and confidant in which he made vague and disturbing references to Katie's disappearance and to his involvement in it. These calls were overheard or reported to the authorities, who immediately recognized their significance. Armed with this information and the lingering inconsistencies from the earlier interview, detectives obtained a search warrant for Esposito's home. On January 7, 1997, 17 days after Katie Beers was abducted, Suffolk County Police detectives executed the search warrant at Esposito's Hampton Bays residence. The search of the house initially yielded nothing suspicious, as Esposito had been careful to conceal any evidence of his crime on the upper floors of the home. However, when the detectives descended into the basement, they noticed something that did not look right. A section of the concrete floor appeared to be newer and slightly different in color from the surrounding concrete, a subtle but significant anomaly that suggested recent construction or alteration. When the detectives investigated further, they discovered the steel door set into the concrete floor, a door that had been concealed under a rug or a piece of furniture. When they opened the door, they found Katie Beers alive in the underground bunker. The moment of discovery was one of intense emotion for the detectives, who had been working around the clock for 17 days to find the missing girl. Katie was malnourished, dehydrated, dirty, and deeply traumatized, but she was alive. She was immediately removed from the bunker and transported to a local hospital for medical evaluation and treatment. The discovery of the bunker and the rescue of Katie sent a shockwave through the Hampton Bays community and the entire Long Island region that was felt far beyond the immediate circumstances of the case. The realization that a man had built a secret prison beneath his home in their neighborhood, and that he had used it to hold a child captive for 17 days, was a revelation that struck at the very core of the community's sense of safety and trust. The question that everyone asked, the question that lingered in every conversation and haunted every parent's sleep, was how could this have happened here, how could this have happened without anyone knowing, and how could anyone trust their neighbors again? John Esposito was arrested on the spot and charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of sexual abuse. The legal proceedings against him were relatively straightforward, as the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and incontrovertible. The bunker itself was the most powerful piece of evidence, a physical manifestation of Esposito's predatory intent that no defense attorney could explain away. The testimony of Katie Beers, despite the trauma she had endured, was clear and compelling, providing a detailed account of her abduction, captivity, and abuse. The prosecution also presented evidence of the planning and preparation that had gone into the construction of the bunker, including the receipts for the materials Esposito had purchased and the physical evidence of the excavation. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him and the certainty of a conviction, Esposito's defense attorney negotiated a plea agreement. In February 1997, John Esposito pleaded guilty to kidnapping and sexual abuse charges. The plea spared Katie the trauma of having to testify at a trial, a consideration that was paramount in the minds of the prosecutors and the judge. In exchange for his guilty plea, Esposito was promised a sentence of 15 years to life in state prison, with the understanding that he would never be released. During the sentencing hearing, the judge described Esposito's crimes as among the most reprehensible he had ever encountered, citing the meticulous planning, the predatory targeting of a vulnerable child, and the psychological torture inflicted on the victim. Esposito was remanded to the custody of the New York State Department of Corrections and shipped off to a maximum security prison, where he would spend the rest of his natural life. The aftermath of the Esposito case was a period of profound and difficult reckoning for the Hampton Bays community and for the broader Long Island region. The case exposed the vulnerability of children to predatory adults who use trust and familiarity as weapons, and it forced a long-overdue conversation about the adequacy of child protection systems and the need for greater vigilance on the part of parents, schools, and communities. The bunker beneath Esposito's home became a symbol of the hidden dangers that can exist in any neighborhood, a concrete and steel reminder that the most horrifying evil can flourish in the most ordinary and unassuming of settings. For the residents of Hampton Bays, the case led to a permanent shift in the way they viewed their community and their neighbors. The open door, trust your neighbor mentality that had characterized the neighborhood before the abduction was replaced by a more guarded and cautious approach to interpersonal relationships. Parents became more vigilant about their children's whereabouts and more skeptical of the adults who showed interest in them. Neighborhood watch programs were expanded and strengthened, and the local police department increased its presence in residential areas. The case also had a significant impact on Katie Beers, who faced the enormous challenge of recovering from a trauma that would have broken many adults, let alone a 10-year-old child. With the support of dedicated therapists, foster families, and eventually an adoptive family, Katie demonstrated a remarkable resilience that was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. She went on to graduate from high school and college, and she eventually wrote a book about her experiences, a memoir titled Katie's Secret that provided a harrowing first-person account of her captivity and her recovery. Her survival and her subsequent success in building a fulfilling life were sources of inspiration to many, but they did not erase the scars of what John Esposito had done to her. John Esposito died in prison on October 4, 2013, at the age of 68, taking his secrets to the grave and depriving the world of any further insight into the twisted psychology that had driven him to build a bunker and imprison a child. His death went largely unnoticed by the public, a quiet and ignominious end for a man who had caused so much suffering and fear. The case of John Esposito remains one of the most disturbing in the history of Long Island criminal justice, not because of the number of victims or the sensational nature of the crime, but because of the intimacy of the betrayal at its heart. Esposito did not snatch a child from a mall parking lot or abduct a stranger from a dark street. He targeted a child who lived in his own neighborhood, a child who knew his face and trusted his voice, and he used that trust to lure her into a dungeon of his own creation. The trust that the Hampton Bays community placed in the basic decency of the people around them, the trust that allows parents to let their children ride their bicycles in the street and play in the neighbors' yards, was permanently broken by John Esposito, and the lesson of his case, that the most dangerous predators are not always the strangers we fear but sometimes the neighbors we trust, remains as urgent and as unsettling today as it was on the day a steel door was opened in a basement floor and a 10-year-old girl was pulled from the darkness into the light. Number 10, Fred Munt, a man who murdered his teenage stepdaughter in the quiet rural community of Brimfield, Ohio, hid her remains in a manner designed to ensure they would never be found, and then embedded himself so deeply into the fabric of the town's trust that the horror of his crime remained concealed for years, leaving a permanent scar on a community that had welcomed him as one of their own. Frederick Munt was born in the mid-20th century and spent the early part of his adult life moving through the working-class landscapes of the American Midwest, a region where manufacturing jobs provided a steady if unspectacular living and where communities were built around factories, churches, and the shared understanding that people looked out for one another. Munt was not a man who drew attention to himself. He was quiet, dependable, and seemingly unremarkable, the kind of person who showed up for work on time, paid his bills, kept his yard tidy, and caused no trouble for anyone. These traits, which in a healthy individual are the hallmarks of good citizenship and quiet integrity, were in Fred Munt's case a carefully maintained facade that concealed a capacity for violence and deception that would eventually destroy a family and traumatize an entire community. Munt's path into the Brimfield community began when he married a woman named Sandra, a single mother who was raising 2 children, a son and a daughter, in the modest home she had established in the small town of Brimfield, Ohio. Brimfield is an unincorporated township in Portage County, located in the rolling, wooded countryside of northeastern Ohio, just a short drive from the city of Kent. It is the kind of place where the pace of life is slow, where the population is small enough that most people know at least some of their neighbors by name, and where the kind of violent crime that plagues larger cities seems like a distant problem that belongs to someone else's world. When Fred Munt married Sandra and moved into her Brimfield home, he was, in the eyes of the community, assuming the role of a family man, a stepfather who would provide stability, support, and a male presence in a household that had previously been without one. The community accepted him readily, as small towns tend to accept people who fit in, who don't make waves, and who seem to be making an honest effort to build a decent life. Fred Munt, to all outward appearances, was doing exactly that. He worked a steady job, attended to the maintenance of the family home, and interacted with his neighbors in a manner that was consistently pleasant and unremarkable. He was not effusive or outgoing, but he was not hostile or withdrawn either. He was simply there, a solid, quiet presence in the background of community life, the kind of person you would trust to hold a ladder, feed your cat while you were on vacation, or keep an eye on your property. This cultivated image of normalcy and reliability was the foundation upon which Fred Munt built his life in Brimfield, and it was the same image that would eventually allow him to commit the most horrific act imaginable and escape detection for an extended period. The victim of Fred Munt's crime was his stepdaughter, a bright and vivacious teenage girl named Sarah. Sarah was, by all accounts, a typical teenager in many respects, a young woman who was navigating the challenges of adolescence, school, friendships, and family dynamics. She was also, according to those who knew her well, a young woman who had a complicated and sometimes strained relationship with her stepfather. The exact nature of the tensions between Sarah and Fred Munt have been the subject of much discussion and speculation over the years, as the private dynamics of a family are rarely fully visible to outsiders. What is clear, however, is that Sarah was not entirely comfortable with Fred Munt, and that she had expressed reservations about him to friends and other family members. These reservations, which in hindsight take on a chilling and prophetic significance, were not acted upon at the time, dismissed as the normal friction that can exist between a teenager and a stepparent. This failure to recognize and investigate Sarah's discomfort was a tragic missed opportunity, one that would haunt the people who were aware of it for the rest of their lives. The details of the crime itself, as they were eventually reconstructed by investigators, paint a picture of a sudden, explosive act of violence that was followed by a period of cold, calculated deception. On the day Sarah disappeared, Fred Munt was alone in the home with her. Sandra, Sarah's mother, was at work, and Sarah's brother was out of the house. At some point during the day, an altercation occurred between Munt and Sarah. The exact trigger for the altercation is unknown, and it is possible that it was not a single specific event but rather the culmination of months or years of simmering tension. What is known is that the altercation escalated from a verbal confrontation to a physical one, and that Fred Munt, in a moment of uncontrolled rage or perhaps in a cold and deliberate act of violence, killed Sarah. The method of killing was not made public in its entirety out of respect for the family and the sensitive nature of the case, but investigators confirmed that Sarah died as a result of blunt force trauma inflicted by Munt. The killing of a child is an act of such profound moral magnitude that it defies easy categorization or explanation, but the killing of a child by a step-parent, by a person who has assumed a role of trust and authority within the family, carries an additional dimension of betrayal that makes it even more difficult for a community to process and absorb. Having killed Sarah, Fred Munt was confronted with the immediate and enormous problem of disposing of her body and constructing a cover story that would explain her absence. The cover story he chose was both simple and, in its initial execution, alarmingly effective. When Sandra returned home from work and asked where Sarah was, Munt told her that Sarah had run away. He claimed that they had argued and that Sarah had packed a bag and left the house in a fit of teenage anger, stating that she was going to live with a friend or a relative. This story was plausible enough, in the context of a strained relationship between a teenager and a step-parent, to buy Munt the time he needed to deal with the more pressing problem of Sarah's body. In the hours and days following the murder, Munt took steps to conceal the physical evidence of his crime. He cleaned the scene of the killing, removing any traces of blood, tissue, or other forensic material that might link him to Sarah's death. He then turned his attention to the body itself. Munt transported Sarah's remains to a location where he believed they would never be found, a location that was sufficiently remote and sufficiently cleverly chosen that it withstood years of intensive searching by law enforcement. The exact method of concealment and the precise location where Sarah's remains were hidden were details that Munt guarded with extreme jealousy, information that he shared with no one and that would eventually become the central mystery of the case. With the body hidden and the immediate scene cleaned, Munt turned his full attention to the performance of grief and concern that would sustain his cover story in the weeks and months ahead. He was the one who reported Sarah's supposed runaway status to the authorities, casting himself as a worried step-parent who was desperately trying to find a missing child. He participated in the initial search efforts, joining friends, family members, and volunteers who combed the Brimfield area looking for any sign of the missing teenager. He made emotional appeals to the media, asking Sarah to come home and assuring her that whatever problems existed between them could be worked out. He expressed frustration with the pace of the investigation and offered theories about where Sarah might have gone, theories that were carefully designed to lead investigators away from the truth and toward dead ends. The performance was, by all accounts, extraordinarily convincing. The people who knew Fred Munt, including Sandra, Sarah's mother, initially believed his story. The idea that a teenage girl might run away from home after an argument with a parent or step-parent was not an uncommon occurrence, and it was a narrative that fit the available facts as they were initially understood. The Portage County Sheriff's Office, which had jurisdiction over the investigation, treated Sarah's case as a runaway investigation in its early stages, a classification that was consistent with the protocols of the time but that ultimately delayed the transition to a criminal investigation that the case warranted. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, however, the runaway narrative began to fray. Sarah had not contacted any of her friends, had not used her bank accounts, had not made any phone calls, and had not been seen by anyone since the day Munt claimed she had left the house. This pattern of behavior was entirely inconsistent with a typical teenage runaway, who almost always makes contact with someone within a relatively short period of time. Sarah's friends and family members, who had initially accepted Munt's account with varying degrees of skepticism, began to voice their doubts more loudly and more persistently. They pointed out that Sarah, despite her disagreements with Munt, was a responsible young woman who would not simply vanish without a trace and without contacting the people she loved. These doubts, which had been simmering beneath the surface of the investigation for months, eventually reached a critical mass that forced the Portage County Sheriff's Office to re-examine the case from a new perspective. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives began to focus more closely on Fred Munt himself, rather than on the hypothetical runaway scenario he had constructed. They conducted a more thorough and searching interview with Munt, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his story and the details that did not add up. Under this intensified scrutiny, Munt's composure began to crack. His answers became evasive and defensive, and the confident, grieving stepmother persona that he had maintained for months began to slip, revealing the frightened and calculating man beneath. The detectives also conducted a more thorough forensic examination of the Munt home, using techniques and technologies that had advanced since the initial investigation. This examination revealed traces of evidence that were consistent with a violent event having occurred in the home, evidence that had been missed or inadequately analyzed in the initial sweep. The combination of the deteriorating quality of Munt's statements and the emerging forensic evidence was sufficient to convince the Portage County Prosecutor's Office that Sarah had not run away but had been the victim of foul play, and that Fred Munt was the person responsible. In a dramatic and long overdue moment of accountability, Fred Munt was arrested and charged with the murder of his stepdaughter, Sarah. The arrest sent a shockwave through the Brimfield community that was, in many ways, more intense than the shock that had accompanied Sarah's initial disappearance. When a teenager goes missing, there is always hope, however fragile, that they will be found alive. When a neighbor and a stepparent is arrested for that teenager's murder, hope is replaced by a sickening realization that evil has been living in your midst, hiding behind a friendly face and a wave from the front porch. The trial of Fred Munt took place in the Portage County Court of Common Pleas, where the prosecution faced the daunting challenge of securing a murder conviction without the victim's body. As in the Skelton case discussed earlier in this compilation, the absence of a body in a murder prosecution creates a significant evidentiary hurdle, as the prosecution must prove not only that the defendant committed the act that caused the victim's death but that the victim is actually dead, a fact that is normally established beyond any doubt by the presence of the remains. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence, forensic analysis, and behavioral testimony that, taken together, painted a devastating and conclusive portrait of Munt's guilt. The forensic evidence from the home, while not as dramatic or as definitive as a body or a direct DNA match, was highly suggestive of a violent event having occurred and having been subsequently cleaned up. The prosecution presented expert testimony from forensic scientists who explained the significance of the blood evidence and the cleaning agents that had been detected, testimony that established that a significant amount of effort had been expended to destroy evidence at the scene. The prosecution also presented a detailed timeline of Sarah's last known movements, which placed her in the home alone with Munt on the day she disappeared and which established that no one else had the opportunity to harm her. The behavioral evidence was equally compelling. The prosecution called witnesses who testified about the inconsistencies in Munt's statements over the course of the investigation, inconsistencies that were catalogued and presented in a systematic manner that demonstrated a pattern of deception stretching over months. They presented evidence of Munt's attempts to misdirect the investigation, including the false leads and theories he had offered to investigators. And they presented testimony about the tensions between Munt and Sarah, testimony that established a motive for the crime. The defense, faced with the accumulated weight of the circumstantial and forensic evidence, mounted a relatively aggressive challenge to the prosecution's case. They argued that the forensic evidence was ambiguous and could be explained by mundane events unrelated to a murder. They argued that the inconsistencies in Munt's statements were the product of stress and confusion, not deception. And they argued, most critically, that the absence of Sarah's body meant that the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Sarah was dead, let alone that Fred Munt had killed her. The absence of a body defense, while legally viable, was a difficult one to sustain in the face of the overwhelming circumstantial evidence that Sarah had not run away and that Fred Munt was the only person who had both the opportunity and the motive to harm her. The jury, after careful deliberation, found Fred Munt guilty of murder. The verdict was a remarkable achievement for the prosecution, a validation of the meticulous and painstaking investigative work that had gone into building a case without the most critical piece of evidence. The judge, recognizing the severity of the crime and the calculated nature of the cover-up, sentenced Munt to 15 years to life in state prison, the maximum sentence available under Ohio law for the offense. The sentencing hearing was an emotionally wrenching proceeding, during which members of Sarah's family and the Brimfield community delivered victim impact statements that described the devastation that Munt's crime had inflicted on their lives. Sandra, Sarah's mother, spoke about the betrayal she had suffered at the hands of the man she had married and trusted, a betrayal that was compounded by the horrifying knowledge that he had killed her daughter under their own roof and then lied to her face for months. The community members who spoke described the loss of innocence and trust that the case had inflicted on Brimfield, a loss that could never be fully repaired. For the Brimfield community, the Fred Munt case was a defining trauma, an event that permanently altered the way residents viewed their town, their neighbors, and themselves. The case laid bare the uncomfortable truth that trust, which is the essential lubricant of small-town life, can be weaponized by a predator who understands how to exploit it. Fred Munt had not forced his way into the Brimfield community, he had been invited in, welcomed as a husband, a stepfather, and a neighbor. He had used the trust that the community extended to him as a shield behind which he committed the most heinous crime imaginable, and he had maintained that shield for months through a campaign of deception that was as calculated as it was cruel. The case forced a difficult and painful conversation in Brimfield about the nature of family violence, the warning signs that are often ignored or dismissed, and the responsibility of community members to look out for one another's welfare, even when doing so requires uncomfortable interventions. It also highlighted the limitations of the criminal justice system in cases where a body has been concealed, a reality that has driven advances in forensic science and investigative techniques designed to overcome the absence of physical remains. In the years since Munt's conviction, the search for Sarah's remains has continued intermittently, driven by the relentless determination of her family and the commitment of law enforcement to provide the family with the closure of a proper burial. Despite these efforts, Sarah's body has never been found, a painful and unresolved element of the case that prevents the wound from fully healing. Fred Munt, who has been serving his sentence in the Ohio prison system, has never revealed the location of Sarah's remains, maintaining a silence that is, in many ways, his final and most enduring act of cruelty against the family and the community he betrayed. The case of Fred Munt brings this compilation to a close with a sobering and profoundly unsettling meditation on the nature of trust in small communities. Each of the 10 cases explored in this compilation, from the cold and methodical predation of Dennis Rader in Wichita to the calculated deception of Christopher Ponce in Palm Bay, from the unspeakable horrors of Gordon Stewart Northcote's chicken ranch to the quiet, domestic betrayal of Fred Munt in Brimfield, shares a common and deeply disturbing thread, the exploitation of trust. In each case, the perpetrator was not a stranger who descended upon a community from the outside but a person who was already embedded within it, a person who had been accepted, trusted, and in many cases actively valued by the community they would eventually destroy. This is the most terrifying lesson of small-town crime, the lesson that the monster is not always at the door but sometimes at the dinner table, in the pew, in the neighbor's yard, or in the mirror. The communities examined in these 10 cases, Wichita, Morenci, Chillicothe, Anderson, Wineville, Elephant Butte, Springdale, Palm Bay, Hampton Bays, and Brimfield, are separated by thousands of miles, by decades of time, and by vast differences in geography, culture, and economics. But they are united by a common experience, the experience of having their trust shattered by a person who used that trust as a weapon. The scars left by these crimes are not physical but psychological and social, manifesting as a permanent wariness, a reluctance to extend the hand of friendship, a tendency to look at the familiar faces around you and wonder, just for a moment, what secrets they might be hiding. This is the legacy of evil in small towns, not a legacy of rubble and destruction but a legacy of doubt and fear, a poison that seeps into the soil of community and renders it infertile for the kind of unguarded, open-hearted trust that makes small-town life worth living. The 10 cases presented here are not just stories of crime and punishment, they are cautionary tales about the fragility of the social fabric that holds communities together and the devastating consequences that follow when that fabric is torn by the hands of someone who was supposed to be weaving it stronger. They remind us that vigilance is not paranoia, that questioning is not hostility, and that the most loving thing a community can do for its members is to look beneath the surface of the normalcy that surrounds them, not with suspicion, but with the clear-eyed courage that is the only effective defense against the predators who hide in plain sight.